7 Falchion Base, Chapter 1, Septimus. Chapter 1, Septimus Annus Est. January 5th, 2544, 10:25 hours military calendar. Epsilon Eridani System, Reach. In upper atmosphere, over the Viri territory. Asterisk. The Pelican bulleted through the atmosphere as part of a squadron with 2 others headed towards the surface of Reach. The planet itself was the hub of human intersystem expansion and the very heart of the United Nations Space Command. UNSC Fleet Command, or FLETCOM, was responsible for ship deployment, mission structures, and space operations undertaken across human-controlled space, and their headquarters just so happened to be here as well. That fact alone made Duncan feel something difficult to describe, like knowing you were descending to the throne room of giants. In the more than week-long journey that it took for the Achilles to arrive in system, Duncan had been at the center of suspicion on the ship, for others and himself. Why was he here and not with the 10th? He couldn't make any sense of it. He couldn't make much sense of his newest comrades either. Duncan and the others assigned to the 7th Battalion had gotten to know 2 of the ODSTs on board and already in active service, the 2 he had seen on Nassau Station. Private Second Class Zachary Matthews, or Zach, was for all intents and purposes an attention lover. He constantly hung out with the 30 new additions to the 7th in the ship's cafeteria, telling them one interesting tale after another of missions he had gone on and things he had seen. While some were borderline unbelievable, what swung the widest across the spectrum of disbelief was the fact that he was only 19 years old and already an ODST. Duncan swore the kid was a self-effacing comedian in a past life. He found a way to make everyone laugh, whether it was at a joke he told or if he himself was the joke. It was often the latter. While Zach was more welcoming, his comrade was his polar opposite. Specialist Shofia Novik, or Nova, appeared serious in almost everything she did. She looked closer to Duncan's age, if not slightly older. She didn't bother getting to know anyone and habitually called out her teammate whenever he was lying about a story. Even though that often left him embarrassed, he always gravitated around her, constantly trying to impress or embarrass her in front of everyone else. Yet Nova seemed to regard him with the same resigned wariness one would reserve for a younger sibling busy showing off to his friends. Duncan was mainly wary of Nova. He had heard her Eastern European accent some time ago and confirmed his suspicions when he overheard her loose, frustrated Hungarian at Zach once. Maybe Mahoney had given him PTSD, but he knew the reputation Hungarians had in the ODSTs. That made him even more nervous around her. He would have to overcome that anxiety soon because, as of now, he was officially on the same squad as them. The 105th Shock Troops Division, 7th Battalion, Bravo Company, 1st Platoon, Squad Epsilon. The staff sergeant had told him when he sought him for answers on where he was assigned. "I'm honored, sir. How many others are on the team?" "Other than Zach and Nova, there are 4 others. I'm not going to tell you anything because I'd rather you meet them in person. That way you won't have the chance to space yourself before we get there." Duncan sensed his sarcasm, but now that they had arrived at Reach and left the Achilles, those words were haunting him. The Pelican jostled, and the internal temperature rose as they entered the stratosphere. Duncan and 10 others from his class sat in the darkened blood tray lit only by the light coming from the reentry flames on the cockpit's window. Staff Sergeant Adel sat next to him, while Zach and Nova were on the opposite side. At one point, Duncan wound up catching Zach's eye. The latter was staring at him, looking like he had a question to ask. "Hey, Staff," he called over. The staff was half asleep. He opened an eye. "Wasn't our guy supposed to be Irish? I heard this guy talk. He doesn't sound like it to me." "And how's that any of your business, Private?" the staff asked. "It's just that I had a few good one-liners stacked up for him. Now they're no good." The staff peered over at Duncan. "Iris, say something Irish." Duncan shrugged and looked at Zach. "Don't know what you're talking about, lass," he said, doing his best O'Reilly impression. "This is how I always sound after a good day's stretch through the foothills." Zach sat back, visibly stunned. The staff and Nova gave each other a knowing look. The Hungarian specialist gave a soft snicker. "Lass means girl," she said. "Nice try, though." Zack blushed red with embarrassment. Then he seemed to taste some mischievous idea and clicked his fingers. "Irish." "What?" Duncan asked. "Your new nickname." Duncan arched a brow at him. "Think about it, just slap an H on the end of your surname. You came in the place of someone Irish. You've got the accent, not to mention you're as lucky as a leprechaun to be joining the 7th. He said the last part in a mock Irish accent that Duncan felt would have earned him a broken nose from O'Reilly had he heard it. Zack flashed a toothy grin. "We don't just accept anyone, only the best of the best." "More like the best and then the rest," Nova said under her breath. Zack heard it and glowered at her. "What do you mean, the rest?" Nova stared him down, unamused. Again, Zack's face flushed red, and he looked away, brooding by himself. "Don't mind him," the staff told Duncan. "He's the bulk of my worries but the least of yours, and since you'll be on my squad, you have my genuine apologies for treating you so harshly back in Saul." Duncan nervously swallowed and nodded. "I understand, sir. It was a confusing situation for everyone involved." The staff looked off to the ceiling, deep in thought. Not everyone. The Pelican rattled upon entering the troposphere. "Personnel acquisition gets me grumpy. You'll find I'm not so bad on most days." Duncan mulled over what he said. He glanced at Zack and gawked when he saw that he was pretending to strangle himself with his seatbelt. "What are you implying, Private?" Zack winced. The staff had his eyes closed, yet he seemed to sense the suggestion. "I was just showing Irish how to use a seatbelt under emergency crash conditions, sir." The staff gave a subtle nod of his head. "Carry on smartly." Zack sighed with relief, but out of the corner of his eye he spotted Nova looking at him. "You heard the staff sergeant," Nova said, pointing to the seatbelt. "Carry on smartly." Asterisk. The squadron eased out of their re-entry vectors and began a smooth flight across the morning skies of Reach. They soared over icy mountain peaks and desert valleys, headed north across the Viri territory. The trip lasted another hour. Duncan could tell when they had reached their destination the moment they slowed to a stop and started to descend. Mechanics whirred as the dropship's landing gear extended and touched down on the helipad. "Let's move at ODSTs," the staff said as he got on his feet. Everyone followed suit, taking their duffels out of the overhead netting. The dropship's rear door opened and daylight flooded into the blood tray. Duncan had to squint as they walked down the ramp. What he saw next made him marvel. The upper crest of a large mountain lavished in towering Douglas firs and cedar trees rose in front of him. The mountain shot up another 2,000 meters, where a thin layer of cloud cover crowned it. It was a part of a series of mountain ranges that rose up across the region and descended into valleys. Everything was clothed in a vesture of emerald flora, whose seams were sewed together by an intravenous network of streams, rivers, and lakes. What added to his amazement was the large, urbanized landscape that occupied a flattened area where the mountain plateaued. The massive assortment of buildings and structures formed a maple leaf-like organization. They branched out as 5 distinct extensions of structures before coalescing at an elevated plain. Several layers of barbed wire fencing hemmed it all in. The entire area was aglow in the morning light. The Pelicans had landed on the helipads of a decent-sized airbase in one of the outer extensions. Looking at the others on adjacent pads, Duncan could tell they were just as overwhelmed as he was. The staff sergeant turned to face the new arrivals. "Welcome to Falchion Base, the ancestral home of the 7th Orbital Drop Shock Trooper Battalion." The statement earned more amazed looks from the gathering. "Don't mind the size. You'll have to pull your own weight if you want to make it out here. Today you'll be shown the basics. Then you're on your own." Duncan spotted a convoy of a dozen warthogs, troop carrier types, coming down the road towards them. They came to a stop in front of the helipads. "Our rides are here," the staff declared. "Let's move." The ODSTs headed down staircases to the asphalt below. While most of the new arrivals loaded up on the closest troop carriers, There was one hog further off to the side. The staff urged Duncan to follow the rest of the team over to it. There was a man in the driver's seat. He looked around Duncan's age and closer to Cosmo in physique and stature. His messy, unkempt hair somehow looked just within regulation limits. He was also resting his head on the wheel. All the same, it was the other guy that got Duncan's attention. He sported a buzz cut with tiger stripes on either side. Like Nova, he had distinctly Slavic high cheekbones. He was also staring right back at him and ignoring the rest of the group. He jumped down from the hog and stood in their way, nodding at Duncan. KTO Novia Krav? That wasn't UNSC standard English. It took Duncan a full second to realize he was speaking Russian. On Nasha Novia Krav, Nova answered, sounding tired. Privike Yuri. The guy cocked his head at Nova, then to the staff as if seeking confirmation. He eyed Duncan closely. I guess you'll do, newbie. He had a rough command of English. He stepped aside to let them pass. The staff walked to the passenger side of the Warthog and spotted the trooper sprawled over the wheel. Heck, wake up, it's time to go. The man gave no response. Nova. Nova nodded as she reeled her hand back and slapped the driver on the hip. He quickly shot awake at the sharp sting to his backside. His face was mostly unshaven with the shadow of sleeplessness under his eyes. He looked relaxed despite the harsh wake-up call. Guess I clocked out for a sec. He scratched the stubble on his face and gave an apologetic smile to the staff. Sorry about that. Welcome back, boss. What ray you so tired for? The staff asked. The man sighed explosively. It's Deeks. He's been doing another one of his safaris, had me chauffeuring him for almost the entire week up until earlier this morning because I lost a bet. Barely gotten any sleep. Nova gave Adel a wary look. What's he got in mind for the menu this time? Moa, the guy said matter-of-factly. It's their mating season, so they're active near the lakes around this time. I see. Say, how'd you even make it this far without passing out? I don't trust Yuri piloting a ground vehicle to save my life. I drove us up once the center told us you'd arrived. Yuri's constant shouting kept me going. Yeah, the man named Yuri yelled unnecessarily loud, his accent strong. And I wouldn't even trust you wit, driving a Hornet without crying it into Mount C. Saba over there. Inside voice, Yuri, Nova scolded. Why, we're not inside. I told you, use your inside voice when you're outside. Fine. Nova pressed her hand into her temples. Toop. I heard that. The staff spotted the rest of the convoy starting to leave. Heck, troop section. Duncan, Yuri, Zach, you two. Nova, take the wheel. Nova let the exhausted driver step out before taking his place while the staff hopped into the passenger seat. Everyone else piled into the troop section. Nova started up the Warthog, and they joined the rear of the departing convoy. They drove along the extension, headed towards the larger amalgamation of buildings. As they went, Duncan realized that the whole thing looked less like a battalion headquarters and more like a large town. There were ammunition storage facilities, commissaries and training facilities, mess halls, hospitals, and even restaurants combined with routine fortifications placed at strategic sectors. Other warthogs and even mongooses drove around the various streets. Squads of Marine military police headed to different stations. Maintenance personnel and units from other forces currently in transit went about their business. Duncan spotted a number of persons in ODST fatigues among them. The way they merged seamlessly together with other pedestrians added to the base unusual feel. Duncan was reminded he wasn't alone when the larger ODST beside him nudged him in the ribs. What's your name, rookie? Irish, Zach cut in, leaning over from his seat on the opposite side. See, we were supposed to get an Irish guy, but... The larger man held up a finger to his lips at Zach. The latter retreated and sat back down in irritation. Duncan Iris, Duncan said, private. The man nodded and held out a hand. Hector Paulson, private second class, peeps call me Heck. The two shook hands. Hector pointed around Duncan. And that hot mess sitting next to you is... I can introduce myself just fine, the person in question declared adamantly. Duncan turned to him. He wasn't so enthused to see the wild glare in his eyes. It unexpectedly diminished once he focused on the newbie. He gave Duncan a welcoming grin. "Mastovich," he said. "Yuri Mastovich, private second class. Both comrades and enemies know me as Matchstick." "Why's that?" "Because he's gonna turn into one if he doesn't learn how to pilot his pod right," Hector answered. Yuri snarled at him, all semblances of hospitality suddenly evaporating. "Yeah, I'll pilot it right on top of you. Then I'll ask whatever's left if I did a good job." "Inside voice," Nova said from the driver's seat. Yuri simmered a little. He lightly slapped Duncan on the back. "I wish you the best of luck, newbie. Hope you last longer." "Longer?" Duncan turned to Hector for an explanation, but the man shook his head. "I wouldn't worry about it. And I'm pretty sure he's an undiagnosed bipolar, so I wouldn't worry about him either." "Hey, guys," Zach said, leaning over the small wall between them again. "Should we warn him about Deeks? I mean, I know Ricky will give a good first impression, but Deeks has that." He waved his hand over his mouth, thing he does. "Who's Deeks?" Duncan asked. Hector and Yuri looked at each other. The former looked away towards the passing buildings while the latter laughed to himself, but said nothing more. "Come on, guys," Nova insisted. "You don't need to make him out to be any stranger than he actually is." Hector gave her a doubtful look in the rear-view mirror. "You volunteering to tell him, Nova?" The redhead winced and suppressed a small, sardonic laugh. Staff." "He's a freak," the staff put with such simplicity that it made it sound normal. "Aren't we all freaks, sir?" Nova asked. "Indeed, you are, my freaks, but Deeks is in a class all his own." He looked into the rearview to meet Duncan's eye. "Like I said, I'd rather you meet them firsthand than take my word for it." If Duncan was worried before, he was terrified now. He still kept it to himself. "Understood, sir. Can't wait to meet him." Asterisk. The convoy passed into the central area of Falchion Base. Here the buildings formed layers of semicircles around a focal point near where the hosting Mount C. Saba rose up again. At the center was the center. It was a several-story tall structure that served as the dominant administrative building for the logistical coordination of the entire 7th Battalion. Architecturally, it started off squarish from its wide foundations before rounding off into a domed roof. As they circumvented it, the lead warthog carrying the lieutenant colonel diverged from the column and parked outside while everyone else carried on. They headed further in and stopped at another building. It was easily one of the largest in Falchion at over 10 stories tall. There was a sign that read, "Dant." The ODSTs disembarked with their bags and assembled before the staff at the front door. "This is the Dante building, Bravo Company's barracks. The other companies have their own buildings in other parts of Falchion. I'll help you guys get settled in. Your squad leaders will meet you in your rooms after that." Hector and Yuri opened the doors for them, allowing them in. The interior reminded Duncan of a hotel as they walked across the lobby. Adel worked with the front desk staff to get them their room assignments. From there, they headed into the available elevators. Duncan was taken up to the 5th floor. They came out into what was essentially an open area. There were no separative barriers, only aisles and aisles of bunks that formed a maze on the floor and lockers that adorned the far walls. There was little if any privacy save for a large, rectangular communal bathroom off to the side. "Over here, Iris," the staff said. He led Duncan across the room. Others were already there. Some slept or talked with teammates on their bunks. Duncan caught a few wary looks as he passed by. He followed the staff into a particular section of bunks. On the way, he caught sight of something strange. It was a bunk near a window with a good view of Falchion. Tied from one end of the frame to the next were strings with teeth weaved onto them, almost like necklaces. There were hundreds of teeth and dozens of individual necklaces hanging from the top and bottom bunks. Upon closer inspection, he found that there was an order to the madness. Each row of overhanging necklaces had teeth belonging purely to one particular species beaded onto them. None were discernibly human. Duncan reached out to touch one. "I wouldn't do that, my friend," a voice said from behind. He turned and immediately found it strange that he hadn't initially seen the man sitting on the opposite bunk. He was visibly Hispanic with a caramel skin tone. His spiky hair was shorn into a low mohawk. He sat cross-legged with a bowl of cereal in hand that he looked to be enjoying until Duncan came in. He examined the newbie from top to bottom. "You knew?" "Yeah," Duncan said and introduced himself. He held out his hand to shake. The guy took a last spoonful of cereal and put the empty bowl in his hand. "Rico Korkeva," he said, "private second class." He scrutinized Duncan, who still looked perplexed at the bowl. Rico burst into laughter. "I'm just messing with you, man." He took the bowl back and actually shook his hand. "I'd welcome you to the team, but I'm guessing that staff already did." The staff and Zach arrived at the same time. "Guess you met Ricky," Zach said. "Hey, staff, little Z, welcome back. Had a good trip." "If I did, do you think I'd really be back here private?" the staff asked. Rico shrugged. "I think so. You love us too much to go MIA." The staff gave an amused chuckle, something Duncan hadn't seen before. "Looks like Deeks is back," Nova said from a nearby window. The others filtered through the bunks to join her. Outside, a mongoose slowed to a stop in front of the Dante building. 2 ODSTs were riding it, both dressed in ODST BDU. Surprisingly to Duncan, but unsurprisingly to everyone else, there was an ostrich-like creature roped to the carriage. Its dirt-covered feathers suggested they had dragged it using the mongoose. The trooper manning the rear laid his sniper rifle over his shoulder and took off his helmet so that his shaggy dark hair could breathe. He had brown eyes with faint dark circles under them. Duncan could tell right away that there was something off about him, but he couldn't figure out what exactly. The ODST he assumed to be Deeks nodded at the driver as he drove off with the dead bird in tow. He entered the Dante building. A few minutes later, he came out the elevator onto the 5th floor. He spotted the gathering on his way over to the bunks and met them with a delighted smile. "Welcome back, family," he jeered. "You guys finally changed your minds about my merch, huh? Want to tell me why you're this geared up for a MOA hunt?" the staff asked, ignoring the earlier offer. Deeks stopped in his tracks and shrugged. "I'm not the only one hunting MOA out there. They're the main prey animals for the Gouda, so I've got to put safety first in case I run into one." The staff nodded, letting him pass to his bunk. Deeks' dark eyes locked on Duncan. "Who's he?" "The newest member of Squad Epsilon," staff answered. Deeks looked at him sideways. "This guy." Duncan started to introduce himself. Deeks cut him off. "Yeah, sure. Hey, while you're enjoying your stay here," he pointed to the tooth-covered bunk, "why not buy some merchandise straight from the front lines, some souvenirs for yourself and folks back home?" "Contraband," the staff admitted. "Contractual bans of goods, sir," Deeks said with a hint of slyness. "You and the Cap both agreed it was fine as long as I wasn't selling Covenant tech." "More like Covenant teeth," Nova sighed, stepping into the gathering. When she did, Duncan noticed Deeks' devious demeanor change to one of faint irritation. "Oh, hey, Nova, when did you get here?" "I always was," she said, arms folded across her chest. "I see." He quickly ignored her, refocusing on Duncan. "So what do you say, rookie?" Deeks gestured over to his bed and crouched down next to it. He put his rifle aside and pulled out a small container from his pocket. He slid it under the bunk to join a number of others, Deeks pointing to the necklaces in turn. "See any you like?" Duncan considered what Nova had said. "What about Covenant teeth?" Everyone else save the staff and Deeks looked at Duncan, as if seeing him for the first time. "You actually want one?" Zach gasped. Duncan nodded. The beginning embers of respect flared in Deeks' eyes. He shifted to the other side of the bunk and pointed to each in turn. "I have grunt tooth necklaces for 10 credits and jackals for 15. I've got several elite ones too, but those are premium items." Duncan examined the variety of sharp animalistic canines and realized this was the closest he had come so far to encountering the enemy. Seeing their looted body parts wasn't the way he expected to go about it. He looked for one in particular. "Got any brute teeth?" A silence Duncan hadn't expected settled on the room. It came entirely from Deeks. Duncan glanced down at him and was caught off guard by the way he was glaring back at him, not threateningly, but with a modicum of blankness and suspicion. "No," he finally answered. He reached for a sheath on his back and pulled out a large meat cleaver that looked like it had seen more action than most combat knives. The fact it was still dripping freshly drawn blood added to that affect. He pointed it at Duncan. "But if you ever find any, you make sure to tell me, all right, friend." The lethal intonations that laced his unnaturally calm voice sent a shiver up Duncan's spine. The meat cleaver did the trick as well. "Sure." Deeks caught a cold glower from the staff. He reluctantly sheathed the cleaver. "Like I was saying, the elites are a premium, so 40 credits. "Sounds like a deal," Duncan said, relaxed now that the giant knife was no longer part of the negotiations. Zach stepped in. "You sure you don't have any human teeth? Those grunt ones look pretty sketchy." "Who knows?" Deeks turned to Zach, eyeing him like a wolf would an unsuspecting bunny. "But I am looking at a nice set of 32 pearly whites if you're offering." Asterisk. "They seem nice," Erica tried saying with a straight face. Duncan gave her a knowing look. After a few seconds, the two broke out into laughter. After meeting all of Squad Epsilon, Duncan needed a break. He found out about the communications cubicles on the 10th floor and took the chance to call in home. Thankfully, Erica was able to answer, and the two were unloading everything that had happened to them in the past week. The conversation easily became one-sided since Duncan had far more to talk about. "Well," Erica said, "maybe it's a good thing they're that crazy. Can you imagine having to fight people like that?" Duncan fervently shook his head. "I see your point, though. It's really going to be something working along with them." "You'll figure it out, D. I know you will." "I hope so." Duncan remembered the object in his pocket and pulled it out, splaying the necklace of elite teeth in front of her. "I bought this from one of them, by the way. Think you'd like it." Erica stared at him wide-eyed. "Oh, honey." Duncan burst into another bout of laughter. "I bought it as a joke, no worries." Erica breathed a sigh of relief. "Don't scare me like that again, please." "Think Noah will like something like this?" Erica shrugged. "Who knows what he'll be interested in once he gets out here? Although I'm probably going to make soccer one of his main hobbies for obvious reasons." The two shared another laugh. As they did, Duncan spotted Nova entering the room over the top of the cubicle. She quickly locked eyes with him. "Hey, hun, I've got to go. I'll call you later in the week, okay?" Erica was confused. "What, already?" "Sorry, a squad mate of mine's coming." "There's a problem if they see me?" Erica put her hands on her hips. When she did that, Duncan knew he couldn't convince her to do otherwise with any easy arguments. "Yeah, what is the problem?" Another voice, a Hungarian voice, said. He froze as Nova came into the cubicle behind him. He was about to explain himself when he heard both Nova and Erica gasp, suddenly turning starry-eyed. "Erica." "Sophie." Confusion washed over Duncan like a tsunami as Nova grabbed his chair and pulled him aside to look at the display. When the two realized who the other was for sure, a gleeful smile formed on either side of the screen. "Oh my God, Sophie, how have you been? If I'd known you would be on Duncan's team, I would have sent something with him." Nova was about to answer when she stopped. She slowly peered back at the newest addition to her squad, bewildered. His expression told her that he was still trying to grasp what was happening. She turned to Erica. "Is he?" Erica nodded before flashing the silver ring on her right hand. Nova glanced back and sure enough, there was a similar one on Duncan's left. Nova pointed. "Him." Her blonde friend gave her another nod, causing the redhead to look between the two of them for a moment. "Why?" Erica's smile dropped into a disapproving frown. Nova held up her hands in mock surrender. "I'm kidding. He's gorgeous. You make a cute couple. I'm happy for you." She pulled Duncan back in front of the display and pointed to Erica's stomach. "Your handiwork." Duncan shook his head. "It was a team effort, and can I ask how you two know each other?" "University," Nova admitted. "I had a few classes with her back when I studied in America." "She's one of my best friends from college," Erica proudly declared. She helped me finish my degree with studying sessions. Hey, remember that one time we went to that cafe on campus and got the new waiter? Remember, Nova huffed. I've still got the scars. The two shared a laugh over that. They talked for a little longer while Duncan watched the entire exchange from the sidelines. To him, this whole situation felt strange. With each joke they shared, Nova transformed from someone he was secretly terrified of to something of a sister-in-law he never knew he had. Then Nova started wrapping up. Well, Erica, it was good catching up, but I have to take Duncan here to a little team meeting. She rested a hand on Duncan's shoulder. But since I know now that he's your hubby, I'll keep an eye on him for you so he doesn't get into too much trouble. I'll make sure he gets back to you after all this. He's trouble all on his lonesome when he's ready, Erica said, laughing to herself. I know you guys will do fine. Duncan, remember, you can trust Sophie here to watch your back, okay? I'll take your word for it, he replied. Catch you later. Erica blew him a kiss and ended the call. In the silence, Nova slowly rounded on Duncan. This time her expression was a bit less reserved and more open. Guess I'm your new guardian angel now? Come on, let's go. Where to, Sophie? She rounded on him again. Call me that a second time and I'll put 3 in your head and 1 in your groin. Only my close friends can call me that. Do you understand me, private? The chill in her voice caught him off guard. He straightened up. Understood. Good, follow me. Where to, might I ask? Like I said, a team meeting. So are you really going to help me survive out here? Nova gave a light chuckle. The staff already told you, out here you'll have to pull your own weight. She gave him an amused smirk as they walked towards the exit. Like you say, it's going to be a team effort. Septimus Annus Est, comrades. 8 Falchion Base, Chapter 2, Imitatio. Chapter 2, Imitatio. January 5th, 2544, 12, 35 hours, military calendar. Epsilon Eridani System, Reach. Sisaba Mountain Region, Viri Territory. Asterisk. When Nova told him that they were having a squad meeting, a pool party was the last thing he had been expecting. But that was essentially what this was. Once everyone had gathered in the Dante Building's lobby, the staff lead them out of Falchion in their personal warthogs. They headed 2 kilometers southwest from Mount Sisaba until they reached their destination, a dormant volcano. Thankfully, any sign of its destructive visage was covered up by forest overgrowth, making it indistinguishable from the neighboring mountains. They had driven up a few hundred meters, parked at the base, and trotted up a long trail until they reached a deep, ovular ground depression. It was an ancient fissure vent sealed by cooled magma. The magma floor allowed the depression to collect rainwater over time until it created a steaming pool that bubbled and frothed at a comfortable 38 degrees Celsius. That was what the staff had told him, at least. Duncan was still hesitant to try it out, unlike the rest of Squad Epsilon who, with bare chests and shorts, jumped in one after another, disappearing under the water for a moment before coming back up to relax on the sides. Duncan stood at the precipice of the vent, in the pair of shorts he'd been told to bring. Nova and Zach, the only other 2 yet to jump in, walked up to either side of him. Scared Irish? Zach chided from his left. No, Duncan said apprehensively. Don't worry, Nova said from his right as she gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Think of yourself as a marshmallow in a mild cup of chocolate. Very hot chocolate, Zach said. No, I don't think. By the time Duncan realized it was a mistake to allow the 2 so close to him, Zach had already kicked his left leg out from under him, leaving him unbalanced enough for Nova to grasp his shoulder and push him over the edge. Duncan plunged headlong into the hot depths. Bubbles raged around him and skin bristled at the heat. He swam back up to the surface and grabbed onto the side. When he did, he was met with jeers and cheers alike. Work on your form, Irish, Rico called over. There was that name again. Duncan looked back up just in time to see Nova, dressed in a 2-piece, dive with good form. She arrowed through the surface and came up on the opposite side. 8 out of 10 would recommend Nova, Hector said, clapping. A shout from up above brought everyone's attention to a nearby tree. Zack ran along its highest branch, launched himself into the air with the grace of a dove, fell 10 meters, then crashed into the water with a resonant pap. That, Nova said, did not sound promising. He's probably a tomato by now, Hector laughed. Zack resurfaced a few seconds later, the skin on his chest and face a bright shade of red. He appeared unfazed, however, and looked expectantly at the others. "Are you okay?" Yuri asked. Zack put on a confident smile. "Don't know what you mean, Yuri, old boy. I'm perfectly fine." "Yuha," Nova said. She turned to the staff who had reclined in a small alcove. "As for today's business," he began, "I called you all out here so we could have a more informal meeting with Mr. Irish. That way we can get to know him better, have a little heart-to-heart." "You have a heart, staff?" Deeks grinned. "None that you know of, Deeks," he replied dryly. "I thought of asking you for a spare, but I figured you probably cut that out too." "Silver Buddha only likes teeth, boss, you know that," Deeks said, his grin only widening. "Noted. Duncan, tell us a little about yourself beyond the files. All I know is you're 24, you graduated from Ravenport, and you somehow ended up getting mixed deployment orders." Duncan felt everyone's attention rest on him. He tried figuring out what to tell them. "I'm a cryptanalyst, sir. I did some computer work as a Marine Reserve back in my home city of Chicago. That's 'cause I was stationed as part of the groundside security team for the local space elevator, the Victoria, so I had to be around to help out with technical problems." Deeks gave an impressed whistle. The staff nodded. "You know, Nova is our resident combat engineering specialist. In terms of squad call signs, she's EP2. Chances are you'll be working with her from time to time. Be careful, though. She tends to fly off the handle if she thinks you're messing things up." "Sisak harez eji shernu munka," Nova sighed. "I only bite a little." "I'd like to see you try," Deeks said, egging her on. Nova growled, "I'll." "Corporal Corey Deeks here," staff said, "is our squad's designated sharpshooter and unofficial orthodontist, call sign EP3. As you've seen, he's got a thing for teeth, and he's something of a government-sanctioned sociopath. However, he's a crack shot with an SRS. You wouldn't want anyone else covering you from long range, I guarantee." Duncan nodded. "What's up with the teeth thing?" "Don't ask questions you don't want to know the answers to, Iris," the staff said and carried on. "Hex our ground vehicle specialist, call sign EP4. You can trust him to get you out of a tight spot in almost any mode of land transportation. Turns out he used to drive limos for high-profile celebrity royalty on tribute." "I decided to take a vacation," Hector said, easing his head back. "The lady I was chauffeuring was too much. Boot camp was way easier to handle. I'd take driving a burning pod through the exosphere over another air-conditioned limo with that piece of work any day." Duncan tried to ignore just how bizarre that statement actually was, and took it at face value. "Over there is what we call a Yuri call sign EP5. It's our aerial vehicle specialist and squad pitbull on occasion. You need wings in the sky, he's your man. He's had experience piloting almost every aircraft under the Air Force's roster." "You name it, I've flown it," Yuri declared with pride. "The only problem is his temper has a bad habit of flaring up at the worst times, and me or Nova have to rein him in." "More like every day," Nova commented. "Not every day," Yuri grumbled. "Why do you try make me sound so bad in front of Rookie when I done gnawing wrong to nobody?" "We're still working on his English," Nova admitted. "Next," staff said, "is Rico over there, our explosive demolitions specialist, call sign EP6. He seems nice now, but he can sometimes get too serious when we're doing wet work, even for me. His temper is surprisingly non-existent, though, so that's a plus." "Gave it all to Matchstick over there," Rico said, giving Yuri a thumbs up. Zack perked up, realizing it was his time to shine. "Aye. EP7, he carries our radio." Zack instantly deflated, earning a laugh from everyone in the pool. Even Duncan couldn't help himself. Zack looked pleadingly to Adel. "Staff," he whined. "There were better ways you could have said it." "Like long-range communications specialist, combat controller." The staff gave him a dismissive nod. I'll remember that the next time we introduce Duncan to the rest of the squad, or even better, when we finally get our CQC expert and medic. Defeated, Zack retreated into the water until only above his nose remained visible. Nova swam over to his side and gave him a reassuring pat on the back. "You'll be fine." "I don't count as CQC, sir," Deeks asked. "Using a butcher's knife to raid corpses that you already put a 14.5 millimeter through from half a kilometer away doesn't count as close quarters." Deeks shrugged and said nothing else. "As for you, Duncan, your call sign is EP8 from here on out. Looks like you'll be our cryptanalyst, and that's about everyone." "Not everyone, staff," Nova said. "What about yourself?" He shrugged. "Not much to know. Call sign EP1. Just your standard grunt. Like all of you, I came to save lives from the Covenant and to take just as many from them in return. Maybe even help bring a stop to all this if it's possible." "Now that we're done with all the intros," Deeks said. He held up his hand and opened his fingers to reveal a rock. A familiar rock. Duncan winced. It was his. "How'd you?" "Found this rummaging through some of your stuff while you were gone. Why do you have this thing anyway?" Deeks threw it into the air and caught it perilously close to the water. Duncan's heart dropped into his throat. Without warning, he swam towards Deeks at full speed. He emerged right in front of him, much to the sniper's surprise, and reached for the rock. "Give it back." "Tell me why first," Deeks said, pushing him back while holding the rock away. When Duncan got too close, he tossed it over to Hector. The man inspected it for a moment, then threw it to Yuri once the owner came barreling towards him. Yuri passed it to Zack and Zack to Rico. Everyone except Nova and the staff participated in the game of hot potato, with Duncan unable to stop it. "Come on, give it back," Duncan demanded as the rock came back to Deeks. "Tell me why first," he repeated. Duncan stopped. "It's important, all right." "Why's that?" Deeks pried. Duncan breathed out a sigh of defeat. "It was from my dad. He got it for me for my birthday as a kid." "What's so special about some rock your dad got you? Couldn't he have given you a real present, or was he just that cheap?" Duncan's face deadpanned. "He died getting it to me, so I wouldn't call it cheap." A deafening silence overtook the pool. The venom in Duncan's voice and what it connotated was potent enough to paralyze even Deeks. The sniper's sly demeanor subtly slackened. He seemed to lose some of his playfulness. So what'd he do exactly that he died for something like this?" "He was an ODST, Duncan replied, in the 7th. All eyes were on Duncan now, and he felt them staring, just like they had at his mother's funeral in Old St. Mary's Cemetery. "He fought early in the war. I don't know the specifics, only that he was killed, but somehow he managed to mail home that same rock to me from the planet that he died on." A flicker of empathy appeared on Deeks' face. "Where'd he, which planet was it?" "Harvest." Deeks stood still for a full 5 seconds. When he finally moved, he focused on the rock. He held it, but not like he had before. He was gentler and more cautious. He looked at the thing in his hand like a man who had just found a childhood toy long lost. Then he seemed to be looking through the rock to something else. The sniper came back from his daze once Duncan held out his hand. "Here," Deeks suddenly reeled the stone back, about to throw it. He saw an urgent expression rise on everyone's face and laughed, dropping it into Duncan's hand. "Kidding." Duncan gave him a wary look before swimming back to his side of the pool. "Sorry about throwing your stuff, man," Zack apologized. "Yeah," Rico echoed. "Lo siento." Hector and Yuri also apologized. Duncan nodded to them in turn, shrugging off any seriousness left in the situation. The tension amongst the squad slowly evaporated, and the air returned to a relaxed air. "By the way," Nova chimed in, "on the topic of fathers, Duncan just so happens to be one in waiting." That got the staff's attention. "That's true, Iris." "Yes, sir," Duncan said. "Aye." He spotted Zack off to the side, cuddling himself and making obscene kissing noises, even giving him a wistful look. He yelped when Nova slapped him on his raw back and quickly slipped underwater to soothe the stinging sensation. "Like I was saying, I've got a little boy on the way. Nova also happens to know my wife pretty well. Who knows? She might end up being Noah's godmother at this rate. Noah, the staff asked. My kid's name, Duncan said. We named him after my dad. Duncan saw something flare in Adel's eyes, a spark of some understanding perhaps, though he couldn't tell exactly what. It disappeared just as quickly as it came. I see, the NCO said. Speaking of babies, Rico added. He flexed one of his biceps. In doing so, he allowed the tattoo of the flaming Japanese kanji on his skin to be seen. How long do you think Duncan has to go before he gets one of these, staff? What's that? Duncan asked. A tat. A mark of honor, the staff answered. It's given to an ODST after they've more than proven their worth as a soldier. We all have one. Well, almost. Their attention turned to Zach. I don't know what you're talking about, staff, Zach said. I've got one. It's just private. Anyway, it's time to go. I'm getting all wrinkly. He turned away and started to climb out. Nova reached up and pulled his shorts down so that his bare backside showed. He told me he wants to have his done on the left one when he earns it, Nova said. Zach panicked and dropped back into the water. When he came back up trying to fix his pants, everyone was already laughing. How long would I have to fight to earn it? Duncan asked. The staff shook his head. It's not how long, but about how much. Cryptic, Deke said. And what does it mean? Duncan asked. By the time you get it, you'll know what it means. The staff replied. Duncan thought on it for a good while. He hoped that it was worth it. If the responses of the other ODSTs as they showed off their tattoos was anything to go by, it undoubtedly was. The display was interrupted, however, when the staff suddenly stood up in the water, pressing his finger to a comm device in his ear. Understood, ma'am. We're on our way. He turned to the others. Pack it up, ODSTs. We're heading back to Falchion. Asterisk. Lieutenant Colonel Garrison looked over the three-dimensional holographic display of the city projected over the table before him. The scenery of abundant skyscrapers was slowly rotating to the left, thanks to the holotank projector. He used his hand to magnify one building in particular. Its eye-catching design and position made it easy to understand why it was chosen to host what was going to be the most important event in the war since Admiral Cole's last stand. If Falchion Base revolved around the center revolved around the coronary, the primary logistics and strategic coordination room on the top floor. Inside, several dozen military tech personnel worked around the clock, issuing deployment orders to ODSTs on and around Falchion, organizing supply lifts and unit transits to and from the base, and delivering and receiving situation reports from other entities. This room effectively made Falchion a node in the comprehensive network of installations that comprised the UNSC presence on Reach. Garrison stood on an elevated platform above the rows of console stations and virtual readout graphs. It was a cross-like platform that divided the room into its four sides: operations, asset procurement, personnel management, and service distribution. Though separated, they connected everyone both on and off base, acting as the collective brain of Falchion. Tell me something, Will, Garrison said. Do you think Hood really intends to make an appearance at this thing? A separate hologram materialized itself from billions of individual bytes into a single, crisp image of a man dressed in 11th century chainmail and a Scottish kilt. The AI known as William, or Will, had fashioned himself after his historical counterpart, claiming everything save his last name, Wallace. His thick beard and Scottish claymore wisped about in a simulated gale that represented the millions of subroutines and microprocesses he was running simultaneously. If the coronary was the brain of Falchion, William was its very soul. He was readily available to help anyone on base given the appropriate request, even the personnel in the coronary. But the bulk of his capacities were spent primarily on working with other AI to ensure the continued information security of the greater military network on Reach. Since Falchion was a node in that network, it was just as much his stronghold as Calendar Wood was to his counterpart. Beneath the center, a basement 20 meters high by 5 meters wide contained his Riemann matrix. All of his higher functioning processes were performed there through his code directory. It essentially was William. But for Garrison, it was easier to see the projection of the rough-looking Scottish warrior as more William than some complex machine underground that he had neither the time nor patience to understand. "Time is short, sir," William said, mirroring Garrison's thoughts as he often seemed to do on purpose. "The Admiralty needs to act swiftly and decisively if they wish to pull a win out of this one." His Scottish accent was well integrated and easily understandable. Garrison considered it as he re-examined the city. "This is going to be a big deal. Waypoint's probably going to have coverage from wall to wall." "You say it like it's a bad thing, sir," Wallace said. "It's a neutral element that could be used against us," Garrison explained. "This is as much for PR as it is for the actual war effort. Morale's always been rock bottom across the UNSC, but it took a critical blow when Cole went out at Cy Serpentes. It might have sunk us for good if he hadn't taken all those ships out with him, so we could at least call it a win. It took everyone else almost half a year to hear about. But if the media live-streams something at this meeting that shouldn't be seen, I'm still of the opinion that someone like Cole wouldn't go out so easily," William said, taking out his large sword to lean on it contemplatively. His actions at the Battle of Theta Ursae Majoris during the insurrection, as well as Groombridge 1830 during the present war, reflect one thing: he has an unerring track record for surviving the impossible. "He blew up a star," Garrison said bluntly. "If you want to calculate the chances that he was the first person in history to somehow survive a supernova at point-blank range, be my guest." "I'll take you up on those odds someday, sir," William quipped. "I know you will. For now, let's focus less on the hypothetical and more on the tactical." Garrison highlighted 4 buildings. Army elements from the 27th and local MPs are providing security details for every building within a kilometer save for these 4. They're too far out to be of any trouble, but close enough to act as observation posts. Since Unicom wants us involved, we'll have 4 Falcons patrolling the outer perimeter while 4 teams are on overwatch in these buildings. "Understood. Who do you want on dispatch?" Garrison thought for a moment. "Where's Harper's platoon right now?" "Captain Harper, Sergeant Joels, and Staff Sergeant Adel are currently at the RTETC with their respective squads." William squinted at something Garrison couldn't see. "They seem to be running a training exercise in the urban warfare unit with only a single ODST. Private Duncan Iris, I believe." Garrison glanced up at the mention of the name. "Iris, huh? They must be testing him out. Say, Will, you've integrated the necessary paperwork for all the new arrivals from the Sol, Beta Hydri, and Alcid systems, correct?" "That's correct, sir. All of them." William ran a cluster of background subroutine checks to confirm the paperwork had been processed in less than a microsecond. "All, sir," he answered after waiting the AI equivalent of a full day for the lieutenant colonel to finish the M in them. The leader of the 7th Battalion nodded. "Brief Harper's troop on the mission details. I want her and her platoon making preparations immediately after." "Understood, sir." "And crack a window. We need some daylight in here." Garrison walked away from the table and headed across the path separating operations from asset procurement. He came to the long window strip circumventing the entire floor as the shutters pulled away. The light of afternoon filtered in, dispelling the darkness inside. It allowed Garrison to take a good look at the base and the men and women moving throughout. It was beautiful and peaceful. He hoped that it would stay that way, but he knew well enough by now that one of those things tended to run out before the other. Asterisk. Duncan pulled the trigger on his MA-37, putting a 3-round burst through the skull of the grunt that had tried to flank him. It was a movable cutout, but the fact he was finally using live ammunition gave this latest exercise a whole new dimension of realism. The status light above the stubby alien flashed red, indicating a kill shot. The 2-dimensional figure fell back, lifeless. Upon arriving at Falchion, the staff brought Epsilon to the base, Real-Time Environmental Training Center, or RTETC. First Platoon's captain had wanted to run a team training simulation to see how well Duncan could integrate with the squad. However, the staff sergeant had convinced her it would be better to see how Duncan fought alone to gauge his individual skill. That left the young trooper in a bit of a spot, since most of his training revolved around operating with a team. Perhaps that was why the staff had suggested it, because he understood that a team was only as strong as its individual members. For that reason, Duncan was currently stuck behind a public fountain inside a spacious courtyard with only 2 minutes left to finish the exercise. The mission was a simple assault run: eliminate all enemy forces within the sector. So far, that wasn't going so well. 30 seconds into the 4-minute exercise, he had gotten pinned by a pair of jackal snipers posted on the far end of the courtyard. He hadn't gotten their exact location before the 2 individual TTR rounds cracked overhead, forcing him to take cover. The cutout frames bearing the depictions of various Covenant forces were stand-ins for the real deals. Gyroscopic spherical wheels gave them a free range of motion in any given direction. The computer hardware built into the frame controlled how fast they moved, often in conjunction with the known movement profiles of the hostiles they represented. The jackals were likely stalking around the rooftops somewhere, while the 3 other grunts that were trying to converge on his position were coming towards him in a slow waddle. He heard their advance stop once he had gunned down the closest of their comrades. Duncan risked peeking over the rim again. He spotted the grunts standing behind some of the many plastic barricades that served as cover across the courtyard. He increased the magnification on his visor to search the several buildings bordering the yard. He scanned their rooftops until he stopped on the 3rd. The presence of the 2 jackals there confirmed his suspicions. The first was standing out in the open, while the second remained hidden halfway behind the rooftop door. They were waiting for him. Duncan decided he wouldn't make them wait too long since he was on a short leash himself. The mission timer ticking down on his HUD was a constant reminder of that. He went for the second jackal first, since it would be the harder target out of the 2. He quickly rose up and fired half a magazine into the distant rooftop door, forcing the targeted jackal cutout to retreat behind it. He ducked just as the grunts and the first jackal returned fire using holes built into their handheld weapons that loosed TTR rounds in place of plasma. Duncan peeked over the other side of the fountain and focused his targeting reticle on the first jackal. Thanks to suppressing the second, he was instantly free to fire several 3-round bursts into it. The rounds tore through its frame. Its status light winked red and it collapsed to the ground. The ODST ducked again as the grunts finally reacted to his change in position. He reloaded his rifle, then got on his stomach and rolled out into the open, much to the surprise of the grunts. This way he presented a smaller target while giving him a direct line of sight on the last jackal as it peeked out from its cover. He gave the trigger 2 light squeezes, producing 2 precise individual rounds that caught the last sniper in the neck and forehead. Its light winked red and it collapsed. The grunts panicked and started to run. Duncan got up and gunned 2 of them down. He found the 3rd waiting to ambush him from behind a barrier and cut it down with a bullet through the eye. With the slight reprieve, Duncan took the chance to look around. Everything looked clear. All he had to do now was reach the other side and the exercise was over. He broke into a jog. Near the end, he caught movement in the corner of his eye. He had a split second to throw himself behind another barrier before a hail of TTR splattered his position. "Where'd they come from?" he asked to no one in particular. He had seen them just in time, the cutouts of the 2-meter-tall creatures that sported blue armor. 2 of them had rushed out in a lateral intercept course to Duncan from wherever they were hiding. Their speed was incredible. They peppered his position with TTR and weren't letting up. The 2 elites were of the minor rank from what he could tell by occasionally peeking out. They fired bursts from one position, then rushed over to new ones so that he couldn't get a bead on them. Duncan noticed his timer was at 40 seconds. From what he had learned from the drill instructors, an ODST could handle a pod of grunts or jackals alone, but an elite was a different story. For survival purposes, it was better to face one with at least a fire team to back you up, even if you were an ODST. And here he was alone with 2 of them. He was considering what to do next when he noticed something next to his foot, a rock the size of his fist. Whether it was there by accident or on purpose, it didn't matter because it gave him an idea. He picked it up, reeled back, and tossed it to the elite on his left. The cutout sensors prompted it to move immediately, registering it as a grenade. Duncan used that against them. He had thrown it so that the only logical direction it could go to avoid it was closer to the other elite. They were close enough for the frag grenade he threw between them a second later to take full effect. The detonation produced shrapnel and an explosion big enough to envelope them both. Duncan immediately strode out from his cover with weapon raised and advanced towards the smoke. As the haze cleared, he saw that one of the elites who had been closer to the blast was down for the count. The other had its status light flashing yellow, meaning it was wounded but alive, still a threat. The hardware the cutouts were made of could take a beating, even a grenade explosion. That said, the elite cutouts were purposefully made more resistant to ballistic and explosive damage to accurately account for the strength of the energy shielding technology that the real ones implored on the battlefield. Duncan rushed the wounded elite, firing full auto into its center of mass as he ran. Its status light flickered more sporadically with each shot, but it refused to flash red. The thing was still standing by the time his assault rifle clacked empty and he was too close to retreat. He leaped up and slammed the butt of his rifle into the elite's chin. This time the status light winked red. It fell back from the blow. Thankfully, it stayed down. Duncan couldn't allow himself to breathe easy just yet. The 20 seconds remaining on his timer prompted him to sprint across the courtyard. He reached the other side right as it hit zero. "Cutting it close there with that last elite," a female voice said over the room's PA system. "Overall, it's a job well done. I can't complain. Come back up here private ASAP." Duncan turned towards the opaque viewing window on the far wall and snapped off a two-fingered salute before jogging towards it. Inside the observation room, the staff watched as Duncan ran across the courtyard towards the exit. "I think he has what it takes to keep up with the rest of the squad. What do you think, Captain?" He turned to the woman in question, who was also watching the new ODST, both from the viewing window as well as the several screens showing camera feeds of the courtyard. Her steely gray eyes watched the displays depicting Duncan on replay at different angles, examining him. At length, she ran her hand through her short, brunette hair in consideration. "He's good," she said simply. "He'll definitely have to get some of his rough edges sharpened, but at least we have a feel for his capabilities. I think that'll only come through experience." Captain Harper and the staff sergeant turned to the origin of the voice. The hefty man standing behind them could have easily passed for a bodybuilder. Considering his lengthy routines in Falchions' gym as well as the muscles that bulged under his fatigues, he might as well qualify as one. Even for an ODST, Sergeant Joels was rather built. He stroked his thick beard in thought. "Iron sharpens iron," he said. "In the same way hell molds a helljumper, got to give him some credit for using that rock to trick the sensors. It shows he's got some ingenuity. That might come in handy." "Maybe so," the staff said. "We'll just need him to be on his best game for whatever this mission is that Garrison wants us on." "We'll all need to be on our best game, Addie," Harper said. "If it's as big a job as we think it is, then everyone's going to need to give their top performance." The squad leaders of 1st Platoon had wanted to test Duncan individually, then see how he fared with the rest of Epsilon. That plan had been scrubbed once Falchion's 2-foot-tall AI appeared in the observation room while Duncan was still running the exercise. William explained to them that Garrison had specifically requested them for an important mission briefing. Harper had decided to wait until Duncan finished the course before the platoon took any action. She wanted to see what particular brand of crazy might be lurking in this helljumper, and now she had a pretty good idea. The door to the observation room opened, and the BDU-clad ODST stepped in, saluting his higher-ups. "At ease," Harper said. She allowed him to relax his stance. "If what you did in there is anything to go by, you should do just fine in this outfit. I warn you, though, that it doesn't mean you'll last long. This isn't Ravenport. You'll need to take whatever chance you can get to improve quickly. Out here, it's do or die, so which would you rather prefer, trooper?" "To do, ma'am," Duncan said, "and let the enemy handle the second one." A partly impressed smile crossed Harper's face, and she nodded to him, turning to the staff. "I like him already." "Thought you would, ma'am," the staff said. Harper pressed a button on the long console lining the viewing window, which caused the entire thing to enter standby mode. "We're leaving now," the captain said. "Something's come up, a new mission we've been selected for. We won't have the time for another practice run with the rest of your squad. You'll simply have to work on integrating during this operation." Duncan processed the new information quickly. "Understood, ma'am." "All right," she said, addressing everyone. "Addie, Joe, are your squads still in place?" "They're still in the lobby," the staff answered, "right where we left them." "I hope so," Joel sighed. "Good," Harper said. "We'll link up with them and head to the briefing room. Whatever it is, let's get this job done nice and smooth." The staff smirked. "Do we get it done any other way, Cap?" Imitatio imitation. 9 Falchion Base Chapter 3 Agit. Chapter 3 Agit. January 6th, 2544, 06:00 hours military calendar. Epsilon Eridani System, Reach. En route to Epos, Viri territory. Asterisk. "Who's Adrian Nemeth?" Duncan asked over team comm despite the drone of the nearby Falcon engine. "Willie explained it in the debrief," Zach said. "What, you weren't paying attention?" "No, I got the whole UEG thing. It's just that I've never heard the name before. Is he somebody important here?" "Who knows? I don't do politics, Irish." Duncan chose to accept that for now as he turned back to the open sea, passing hundreds of meters beneath his feet. Viri's western coast spanned out as far as the eye could see. The lush greenery of the mainland combined with the crystalline waters below gave off some sense of a peaceful vacation. But peace and tranquility were the last things on Duncan's mind. He wanted action. He knew it was better if everything went well on his first mission. Yet his pounding heartbeat, nearly outdone by the mechanical roar of the U-144 Falcon's portside rotor, did little to convince him that that was what he actually wanted. His fingers eagerly flexed on the triggers of the massive M247 heavy machine gun resting comfortably over his lap. The way its blue, circular targeting reticle moved across the landscape tempted him even more. As if to alleviate his silent torment, the Pelican that first platoon was currently escorting came within range. His smart link to the machine gun immediately recognized the contact as friendly and turned green. Duncan wished it were red. Inside were multiple ODSTs protecting a single man. The UEG representative to Reach, Adrian Nemeth, was on his way to an important meeting taking place on the continent of Epos. From what Duncan remembered from the briefing, 1st Platoon would be escorting the representative to the city where the meeting would be held. The event itself would bring about a renewed armament deal between humanity's major governing bodies and 3 parties. The greatest weapons manufacturing company, Misraya Armory, the largest military vehicle developer, AMG Transport Dynamics, and the most expansive naval asset contributor, Sinoviet Heavy Machinery. To put it simply as to how influential they were, every UNSC-issued weapon Duncan had ever held and vehicle he had ever been transported in was made either by Misraya Armory or AMG Transport Dynamics. Even the armor he wore had Misraya's personal stamp of approval on it. Sinoviet also produced the bulk of UNSC Navy starships currently in service. To top it off, UNSC High Command, or HIGHCOM, had sent its own representative in Fleet Admiral Lord Terence Hood, the Chief of Naval Operations and Chairman of the UNSC Security Committee. The man was essentially the de facto leader of the UNSC. In terms of power and authority, Hood was the closest quintessential comparison a human being could make to being God on Earth, or in this case, Reach. Then there was the United Earth Government. The UEG had ceded most of its power to the emergency military government of the UNSC shortly after the Covenant came onto the scene in 2525. That greatly diminished whatever presence Nemeth would have at this meeting. If anything, it was probably a political token or sign of goodwill from the UNSC to include the UEG. But it was just as likely that the latter had no hand in the actual negotiations behind the scenes and was simply here to save face. The deal was being made in response to the unprecedented increase in servicemen joining the UNSC's ranks in the wake of Psi Serpentes. As news spread of Admiral Cole's legendary final stand, destroying over 300 Covenant ships in exchange for his one. It had an unexpected affect across human space. Millions were both moved by the magnitude of his sacrifice, as well as the fact that a single man and his crew could do so much in the face of an unbeatable enemy. Cole had effectively taken a hammer to the Covenant's apparent invincibility and shown that they could be stopped, even by so few. That was enough to make men and women across UNSC-controlled space join its various branches in record numbers in what was recently being dubbed the Cole Effect. Duncan was a part of that, and though the Admiral was gone, Duncan and the millions of others he had inspired to take up arms would be his legacy. However, the surge required an equal rise in equipment development. For that reason, HIGHCOM intended to make a new armament deal with the three major equipment production companies that had already been supporting men and women on the front lines. This would effectively give humanity's war effort against the Covenant a second wind. After the briefing, Harper worked with Squad Epsilon, Sergeant Joel's Squad Echo, and her own Squad Eagle in assigning the necessary positions in the overall operation to each team. Epsilon and Echo would run air patrol in the 4 available Falcons and also set up overwatches in the 4 buildings designated by the Lieutenant Colonel. All the while, Harper and Squad Eagle would provide on-hand protection for Nemeth until they reached their destination. Duncan and Zach were side gunners for a Falcon piloted by Yuri. The ODSTs had prepared throughout the night, then flew to the city of Estergom to pick up Nemeth from the local consulate building. They refueled at the spaceport there before setting out for Epos in the early morning. Tiredness wasn't even a consideration at the moment. Duncan was far too occupied with the thrill of possibilities that his first mission represented. To put it plainly, he was ready to kill something. Then an impulse came that made him shift his weapon sights away from the Pelican before it could manifest. Accidental friendly fire was one thing. Intentional friendly fire was something else. He forced his anxiousness to the back of his mind and tried focusing on the rest of the trip. They had at least another hour left to go, and the star Epsilon Eridani was already cresting the southeast horizon. Someone tapped him on his shoulder. He peered back to see it was Deeks. The corporal sat in the single seat near the Falcon's rear with his sniper nestled in his lap. Nova and the staff were in the 2 forward seats opposite him. "Saw you about to get trigger happy over there. I know it's your first time, and I'm not saying you can't shoot people, right?" He pointed to the Pelican. "Just not those people." Duncan gritted his teeth in embarrassment. Deeks had seen his earlier action with the gun. Thankfully, he didn't see his face behind the visor. Humiliated, he merely nodded and returned to his vigil. "Ep 8 got a point, though, Ep 1, Nova said over comms. "Who even is this guy Nemeth? We've got plenty big shots coming, and we have to escort some no-name UEG rep halfway across Viri." "He's not a no-name," the staff corrected. "He's a necessary piece to the puzzle. The only thing is we don't know where he fits. All we can do is follow orders. If HIGHCOM needs him there just to smile and take up space, then it's our job to get him there." "I don't mind," Hector calmed from his gunner seat on the other Falcon. Speaking from the standpoint of an ex-chauffeur, if the patron's not complaining about the heat, asking for a refund or otherwise showing themselves to be a terrible human being, that's a win. If he's got nothing else going for him, we can at least say he's a decent passenger. "How would you know?" Zach joined in. "He might be torturing poor Harpy and her guys in there." "This is 1 actual to Ep 1, Captain Harper calmed. The staff gave Zach a wary glance. The young trooper probably looked like a deer caught in the headlights behind his visor. "Go ahead, 1 actual. Keep Ep 7 off the comms until we reach our destination. I don't want him distracting anyone from the mission." "Copy that, ma'am." The staff cut Zach's link to Team Freak, leaving him to try and mime his apology at them for the rest of the trip. "Silence is sweetness," Nova commented along the way. Asterisk. Duncan had never seen so many white buildings in his life. It was almost blinding to look at thanks to the way the sunlight from Epsilon Eridani reflected off multiple windows, giving a person seeing it for the first time the impression of a city of jewels. Considering its actual worth, that might be exactly where he was. The skyscrapers of New Alexandria towered overhead, piercing through low-lying cloud cover that shrouded the lower part of the city. All the while, the far outskirts were hemmed in by snow-capped mountains. Nova had told him that when a person said they died and went to heaven, there were usually two possibilities. Either they actually went to the real deal or they somehow wound up in New Alexandria. The city itself radiated such an air of affluent elegance that it made it easy to understand the mix-up. Further to the south, near the city center, there was a single dark monolith that stood out from the rest of the fold, like a literal black sheep. It was by far the tallest structure in the city, easily catching neighboring skyscrapers in its shadow. The staff patted Duncan on the shoulder and pointed it out. "That's Olympic Tower over there," he said, sounding like a local giving direction to a tourist. "It's part of FLEETCOM's headquarters here in the city." Duncan blinked a few times to make sure he was seeing what the staff told him he was. If that was true, then that meant he was possibly looking at one of the most important structures in the UNSC upper echelon, likely within the top 5. Duncan caught himself. There was that feeling again of standing in the throne room of giants, only magnified tenfold. "I wouldn't go there if I were you, though. Grunts like us want nothing to do with it." Duncan detected a level of trepidation in his voice. "Why not, sir?" "Because Olympic itself also happens to be the HQ for a certain group of people that you and I are better off never meeting." "We live longer that way," Nova chimed in. "Amen," the staff said. The young ODST found himself a little confused by that last part. He didn't bother asking any more questions, however, as they flew across the relatively calm airspace over the city. It seemed as though local air traffic was reduced, likely to provide additional security for the meeting. They circumvented the Olympic Tower and headed further south. About a minute into the journey, Captain Harper spoke. "High Octavia is in sight. Everyone ready up. Once we start this, there's no stopping." "This is Echo 1-1 actual," Joel said. "My boys and girls are ready and waiting, over." "Same here," Adel said. "Good," Harper replied. "I'll keep in touch. Epsilon Echo, you know what to do. Let's get this job done." Up ahead, the High Octavia Hotel practically oozed the apparition of higher society with its bright white base color and blue and gold accents that striped it every 10 levels. Its platinum windows looked more like the facets of a rare diamond. While not larger than the Olympic Tower, it was taller than most buildings in New Alexandria, a jewel among jewels. At least 100 journalists from various news organizations were waiting on one of the Octavia's landing pads. Dozens of reporters stood before an equal number of cameramen as they broadcasted the sight of the newest arrival to the hotel. At 100 meters distance, the two front Falcons broke formation and carried on to the north and south, while the other two took up holding positions around the helipad. The Pelican slowed, rotated, and descended on the pad. The journalists focused in on the dropship as its landing equipment settled and the rear door opened. UEG representative Adrian Nemeth was the first to step down the ramp. Nemeth was a pale man. He sported a black suit and red tie with a husky build and a balding scalp. He quickly smiled for the cameras as they recorded him while Captain Harper and her squad came up from behind. The throngs of journalists were kept back by a platoon of military police as Nemeth and his ODST escorts followed him to the large double doors. They stopped and transferred custody of Nemeth over to a squad of MPs waiting for him there. The military police took him inside while Squad Eagle dispersed, taking up positions around the pad. "Package delivered," Harper said. "The 3 company heads are here as well. Looks like Hood hasn't arrived yet. He's got 5 minutes to make an appearance before this whole thing kicks off." "Actually, it looks like he's right on time," the staff said as he looked out from Yuri's Falcon. "I've got eyes on a VIP with escorts coming from the east, over." Duncan peered over to the east. At first, he didn't spot anything through the cityscape. Then slowly a trio of Pelicans came within sight, heading straight for the helipad. When they were half a kilometer away, Duncan spotted 4 more dots coming in just behind them. They, however, quickly resolved into the distinct matte black figures of GA TL-1 interceptors. "Longswords incoming," Nova said. The squadron of 4 starfighters overtook the Pelicans, soaring past them until they reached the high Octavia. They broke into groups of 2 as they zoomed overhead, angling off to the north and south once they passed the hotel. The journalists on the pad sensed the importance of the next incoming dignitary and began surging against the platoon of MPs struggling to hold them back. "The media smell fresh meat," Deeks commented. The trio of Pelicans came up to the hotel. 2 of them broke off and began a patrol pattern around the structure, while the third made a graceful landing on the helipad. The door opened, and the man of the hour strode down the ramp. He was an average-sized man, but each step he took carried with it the weight of unspeakable authority. The bars and commendation medals adorning his shoulders, along with the gold insignia on his cap, paid testament to a lifetime of dedication to the Navy. His uniform was white as snow and easily outshined the buildings of New Alexandria. His aged face exuded a rock-steady confidence that had helped to hold hundreds of colony worlds together in the midst of the greatest crisis mankind had ever known, and hopefully ever would. Fleet Admiral Lord Terence Hood stopped to observe the mass gathering of journalists, cameramen and reporters all crying out his name, begging for an interview. Though he had no time for such things, he gave them a curt nod and a kind smile as the platoon of Army troopers he had come in with escorted him inside. "That's one hell of an entrance," Nova said after the doors had closed. "Honestly, we escorted the wrong guy," Zach said, "if you ask me." "But we didn't," the staff replied, shutting him up. "All right, the first 2 Falcons have got their overwatches in place," Harper said. "EP1, Echo 1, your turn to set up your guys. EP1, you take the west, Echo 1, take the east." "Copy," the staff said. "On it," Joels replied. The 2 Falcons near the helipad broke off and headed in opposite directions. Duncan kept his M247 ready as they passed over the skyscrapers to the west of the Octavia. The further they went, the more he noticed Army trooper platoons that had set up positions on the rooftops of passing buildings. "The 27th?" he asked. "Yeah," Hector answered over comms, observing the situation from the Falcon coming back from the north. "There's probably an entire battalion stationed in this block alone. That's more than enough not to warrant having a platoon of helljumpers, right?" Yuri snickered over Team Freak. "Sounds like you're getting lazy, EP4. It shows they need us despite security. Think of us as cherry on top of cake." "And why don't you think more about flying and not so much about cakes, huh, pal? Plus, I'm uncomfortable now. Thanks for putting that image in my head." "Anything for you, my friend." Zach grumbled. "Great, now I'm hungry." They reached their target building in less than a minute, a regular-sized corporate office. They flew in low until they were 2 meters above the rooftop. "Guess this is my stop," Deke said as he got up. He slung his sniper over his shoulder, then came over and bumped Duncan in the arm. "Remember, don't shoot the civies, that's my job." He leaped down to the roof and quickly ran to the edge. Sliding onto his stomach near the rim, he pulled out the rifle's bipod stand and shouldered the weapon, taking aim at the distant high Octavia. When his sights were right, he nodded at them. Yuri piloted them away. "We'll pick you up after lunch," Zach said, waving goodbye. Deeks gave him a thumbs up before disappearing behind the urban jungle. "Overwatch setup in the western sector 1 actual," the staff said. "Same in the east," Joels called in. "Right on schedule," Harper replied. "Holding patterns, people, let's get it done." They all winked their acknowledgement lights, confirming the order. Yuri brought the Falcon within half a kilometer of the Octavia and proceeded into a holding pattern, traveling counterclockwise with the 3 other Falcons. Each was at least a quarter-kilometer farther away from the Octavia than the other so that the individual aircraft could cover a different sector during their concurrent patrols. It would be at least another 45 minutes before the meeting was over. That meant 45 minutes spent scanning the city below. Though Zach occasionally found something to whine about, the comms stayed mostly quiet. That left Duncan with little to do except sit and think. As he swept his gun's sights over the area, a thought crossed his mind. It wasn't bad, But under these conditions, it wasn't wise either. But his heated blood was cooling to a dull boredom. He decided his idea was better than watching the same buildings passing by every minute. Unbeknownst to anyone else, Duncan used his technical know-how to try linking his helmet to the feed being broadcasted from Waypoint. It required a certain measure of finesse to manipulate the BDU's basic input-output systems, or BIOS, to access a civilian feed, without being blocked by the armor's administrational software restrictions. After using his own neural interface to navigate through several back channels, he found the closest Waypoint server and accessed it. A moment later, the feed appeared in the upper left corner of his HUD. He quickly muted his comms so that no one else could hear the broadcast. If he was going to be out here, then he might as well be informed on the major goings-on. The camera showed a large conference room somewhere within the high Octavia. At least 1,000 sat in the audience seats surrounding a stage. On the stage itself was a table where 5 individuals sat with plaques bearing their names. Duncan recognized Adrian Nemeth sitting at one end. He especially recognized Hood, who sat in the very middle. The other 3 he wasn't so sure about. There was an older man with a lengthy beard, balding like Nemeth. His plaque read, Clark Richardson, President of Misraya Armory. The second, a middle-aged Asian man whose plaque read, Asashi Cassowary, President of AMG Transport Dynamics / Ascalon. Then there was a Slavic man, probably in his 30s. His plaque read, Dmitry Ivanov, President of Sinoviet Heavy Machinery. Each had a mic. Currently, Nemeth was talking into his, giving the welcoming speech to the meeting. Well, it wasn't interesting, but it at least gave Duncan something to listen to. For the next 40 minutes, he multitasked. He scanned rooftops while simultaneously keeping abreast of the meeting. He listened as Company President Richardson gave his speech on the necessity of the deal, espousing his belief in its potential to turn the tide of the war on the ground. Cassowary and Ivanov delivered similar sentiments, Cassowary coming from the standpoint of more ground vehicles, and Ivanov on that of new starships able to go up against the Covenant. Maybe they hadn't realized it until it was too late, but each man took at least 10 minutes to complete their speech. And since Hood was going last, that left him with only 5 minutes. By then, all the attention in the room was on him. Perhaps it always was. Surely someone like the Fleet Admiral could go overtime with no issues. Even so, Hood didn't take longer than a minute. I am speaking to everyone in attendance, he began. I'm not referring only to the people in this room, but to every serviceman that is or will ever fight within the United Nations Space Command. When you became a trooper, a Marine, an airman and naval specialist, by proxy you swore an oath that you would protect Earth and all her colonies. Over the past 2 decades, you and I have both seen how hard that oath is to keep. It's no mystery that we are in a different place than we were before this war began. We've lost much and gained little. It's also no mystery to me why so many of you joined our ranks after the Battle of Psi Serpentes. In Admiral Cole's actions, you saw yourself reflected. You learned that even a single man or woman can make a difference against the likes of the Covenant, even at such a cost. Today, we will honor that cost with our own. Our intention is to provide you with the necessary equipment you will need to take the fight to the enemy, both on the ground, in the air, in space, and wherever else this war may take us. In the end, even though this deal will supply millions, it matters little. What matters is the individual decisions made by you who don the uniform, what you do with what's been given. My hope, and that of everyone in this room, every colony, world, and even Earth, is that you will use it to stop what we now know is not an unstoppable foe. The Covenant are no longer an inevitability. We know this, and so do they. And by the work of one Marine, one trooper, one airman, and one naval specialist, we will show our enemies that mankind is not so easily trodden. Thank you, and Godspeed. Duncan sat stunned for a few moments. The speech was unexpectedly honest. That and it had effectively captured the essence of the last 6 months of his life in 60 seconds. I see why we love him so much, he said to himself. Applause resounded throughout the conference room. Shortly after the end of his speech, the signing began. The camera focused on the table as a folder was handed down, opened, and given the signature of all 5 men. When it was done, it came back to Hood, who stood up to show it to the crowd. Another round of lively applause filled the room. Then everyone at the table stood in unison and walked off the stage to somewhere off-screen. A female reporter came in front of the camera and started commenting on the tremendous nature of what had just transpired, emphasizing how its historic importance would be remembered for generations to come. "Hey, staff," Zach said, "want to hear a joke?" Duncan listened in. The staff turned to Zach with a deliberate slowness. "Remember the longswords from earlier? I guess you could say that Hood brought a sword to a gunfight." Zach patted his machine gun for emphasis and cackled over comms. The staff simply stared at him long enough for his humor to dry up. Beside him, Nova shook her head in disappointment, but Hector was laughing. "You're so corny your blood's made of starch, man, I swear." Zach engaged in another round of laughter. "Hey, heck, want to hear another on?" "Light." Or maybe it was something else. Duncan could only describe it as such when the world around him lit up far faster than it should have, as if someone had taken the sun and put it right behind him at a moment's notice. A sudden boom reverberated through the air. He felt it in his body first as it rattled his bones. Then he felt it in the Falcon a second later as it reeled under the force of the pressure wave that followed, causing them to swerve left and right in a desperate bid to stay airborne. Emergency sirens came on and lights flickered. Duncan bear-hugged his gun and refused to let go as the aircraft went into a tailspin. Yuri must have fought hard to maintain control because they recovered after a few seconds, but had lost 30 meters of altitude. "CHTO Ito Bilo," Yuri roared, his native tongue rising up as he seethed with rage. "Ya chutney potrial avioniku, klianis, yakogo nibud ubu yesli Ito shutka." "Focus, Yuri," Nova said, forcing herself back into her seat. "What was that?" "Look in the southeast," Rico said. "Is that?" Yuri slowly brought the Falcon to bear. Then everyone saw it. A mushroom cloud rose 700 meters high 2 kilometers away. It reminded Duncan of a fiery flower in full bloom. It took him a second to notice that all the nearby buildings had their windows blown out. Even the high Octavia hadn't been spared. The feed of the conference room showed scores of people in the audience screaming and running towards the exits. Duncan quickly shut it off. "EP1 to Echo 1 and 1 actual, do you copy?" the staff called in. Static answered him at first. Then after a few seconds, Joel's came on the line coughing. "I copy what just happened. We've got an explosion 2 clicks southeast of the Octavia. Looks like it took out a whole building." There was a moment's hesitation on Joel's end. "Copy your last, EP1. What about 1 actual you heard from her?" Still nothing. The staff reset his comms. "1 actual you there? Respond, over." There was more static. Then an answer came. "This is 1 actual, I copy all. Whatever that explosion was, we need to investigate. I'm having Eagle work with the MPs to get our 5 VIPs out of here as quickly as possible. There's no telling what that blast did to the Octavia's structural integrity, so we're moving fast." There was a disruption, and the sound of something crashing around Harper. "1 actual." "Still here," Harper said. "Got debris falling on our heads in here. We're taking the VIPs to Lochaber Base. Requesting permission for Squad Epsilon to investigate the explosion," the staff said. There was another silence before the answer came. "Permission granted. Don't get too close. If your avionics run into problems, pull back immediately. Echo 1, I want your team providing escort for the VIP Pelican. We'll all rendezvous at Falchion later, understood?" "Loud and clear," Joel said. "Crystal," Adel added. He opened a direct line to Deeks. "EP3, you still there?" There was another long silence. The ODSTs looked amongst themselves, concerned. "Caught a little wind under my dress, but I'm still here, sir," Deeks finally answered. The relief was almost immediate. "We're picking you up, then investigating the explosion." "Copy that, already waiting." At the staff's behest, Yuri took the Falcon back to Deeks' position. They found the sniper sitting with his legs hanging over the lip, staring contemplatively at the distant mushroom cloud. They got close enough for him to jump on board before heading straight for the site of the destruction. The closer they got, the hotter it became. It took Zach pointing it out for them to notice that the force of the explosion had actually removed the morning cloud cover. It allowed them to see the crowds of morning commuters that had occupied the streets below just before the detonation. Columns of vehicles with blown-out windows had stacked up into a blockage of unyielding traffic. People were running away in human tidal waves from the direction of the blast. Some didn't. They simply lay on the ground, unmoving. Then came the blast site itself. Whatever building had been standing there had already been obliterated down to its very foundations, leaving little but a tall pillar of smoke. Ash rained down from the cloud and covered Duncan's machine gun. He had to clear it away to keep it from building up every other minute. The other Falcon was already circling the mushroom cloud when they joined in. Nothing but devastation stared back at them. The upper half of a neighboring building had been blown apart, and another leaned slightly away in the direction of the pressure wave. Duncan spotted dozens of bodies lying within the blast radius, some lying beneath debris. There was something surreal about the scene that made it almost dreamlike, as if he wasn't really here in this place at this time. Epsilon were heading down to assist, the staff said. Deeks, Hector, you're on lookout. Spot survivors and call them out, and keep an eye out. We don't know if this was the last of the attack. Everyone's green acknowledgement lights winked on, but there was a palpable hesitation from Duncan. The staff knocked on his helmet. Eyes up, Ep-8. Duncan nodded back. Still, worry burned in his gut at the fact that he was about to go down to ground zero. The Falcons descended to street level, and the ODSTs leaped out. They began searching the rubble while their aircrafts took up a holding pattern. They found bodies and their parts, the living and the dead lying together beneath piles of rubble. There were places they couldn't go thanks to raging fires and collapsing structural beams that glowed red-hot. Deeks used his sniper rifle to find one person after the next, placing a nav marker over where people had been partially buried. They dug them out and carried them away. The wounded they placed near a community bus that had been torn in two where Nova did her best to tend to them. The dead they placed near a charred traffic light that had been bent back at an acute angle. The shadow of the smoke cloud was ever present. Duncan found himself wandering into the twilight zone between shock and utter disbelief. This wasn't combat, not the kind he'd been expecting. It was destruction on a mass scale. At one point, he finished carrying the body of a woman with a bloodied shirt to the wounded group. He stared at the smoke column stretching towards the sky. None of the others sounded seriously affected by it, and it bothered him, because it made him aware of just how much of an experience gap there was between them and himself. Even Zach was quiet as he moved from rubble to rubble. Then a thought crossed his mind that he wished hadn't. As bad as this was, it was virtually nothing, a drop in the bucket, compared to what the Covenant were doing and had already done to numerous planets in the outer colonies, and now increasingly in the inner colonies. One destroyed building was nothing compared to a burning world, yet the destruction playing out before his eyes threatened to overwhelm him. He realized that he had understood what the destruction of an entire world meant theoretically. To see even a fraction of that up close was something else. The question left itself burning in his soul: how ready was he for this? Duncan held down the sudden urge to gag. If he let himself go in front of everyone else, he would never live it down. For the time being, refusing to look bad in front of his comrades was the sole motivation that kept him moving from place to place and body to body. Eventually, the first wave of emergency responders arrived on the scene. Sirens wailed as new Alexandria police officers began cordoning off the area and setting up a perimeter. Firefighters came to shoot jet streams of water into the growing flames. Ambulances streamed onto the scene, and paramedics flowed amongst the ODSTs, helping them remove the wounded on stretchers. Still, more searching yielded more bodies, some charred beyond recognition. Most seemed like they hadn't known what knocked them unconscious or killed them outright. All they could do was gather them, sort them out, then search again. They worked for hours. Then Lieutenant Colonel Garrison contacted the staff. He ordered them to return to Falchion immediately and to leave everything else to the emergency teams. Squad Epsilon returned to their Falcons and headed for the coast. As they left, the troopers stared at the thinning smoke cloud and the city growing further away. Even after it disappeared over the horizon, Duncan continued to stare and wonder as to what exactly he had spent the last 6 months getting himself into. Agit Deal 10 Falchion Base Chapter 4 Orem. Chapter 4 Orem, January 10th, 2544, 1520 hours military calendar. Epsilon Eridani System, Reach. Undisclosed location. 4 days after the Molnar bombing. Asterisk. White walls, sterile hallways, and lights without any visible source had comprised everything Lieutenant Riot Cordova had seen for the past several hours. It was enough to drive a person insane given enough time, and knowing who she worked for, there was a high chance that that was its purpose. Perhaps it was a subtle psych examination meant to test the mental state of the person inside. Cordova had to stop herself from overthinking, no easy feat considering her profession. She was paid to overthink, to consider possibilities others wouldn't dare imagine. Oftentimes it was the ludicrous and absurd that proved to be correct. Maybe that said a lot about the times. After all, when was the last time humanity faced an existential threat from a superior enemy? Then again, Cordova hadn't just spent the last 4 days investigating the actions of the Covenant. No, this was a different, much older enemy. Suddenly seams appeared within the otherwise featureless wall in front of her. It formed a door that slid aside with a metallic hiss to reveal a white hallway beyond. An automated woman's voice with a detectable British accent spoke. "Lieutenant Cordova, the Colonel has been expecting you." "I'm sure he has," Cordova said as she got up. She took a deep breath to steady herself, then strode inside. The hallway seemed to stretch on until ceiling and floor met in some extremely distant horizon. After 30 seconds spent walking forward, she stopped and turned to the right. Another door materialized itself inside the wall, sliding apart to reveal a dark room. Cordova willed herself to step inside, and the doors closed behind her. A single ceiling light turned on over a chair placed in front of a large table. She pulled out the chair and sat down. As far as she could tell, there was no one else in the room. It was quiet. She shifted in her seat and the walls absorbed the sound. Where was he? Cordova knew the AI had allowed her access to the debriefing room for her scheduled report. Her co should be here. "I believe you have my report, Lieutenant," a male voice said from somewhere in the dark. Cordova stiffened and peered further into the room. She couldn't tell whether it was her imagination or if her eyes were actually able to carve out a single silhouette, a shadow whose vague shape melded and dissolved with the surrounding blackness. It just so happened to be sitting opposite her. Cordova swallowed. "Yes, sir, I believe you received my files." "Yes," the darkness replied. "Wait. ADT 68499, the dark interrupted. "Activate the presentation board and upload Cordova's report to it, as well as my personal pad." The British-sounding AI answered. "The requested file has been successfully uploaded to both devices." Behind Cordova, a presentation board activated and its light filled the room. As it booted up, it showed a black and white pyramid with a central circle, the symbol of the Office of Naval Intelligence. "Lieutenant, if you would be so obliged." Cordova looked back to the faint silhouette and noticed that it was still difficult to distinguish from the rest of the room. She got up and stood near the board. It sensed her presence, and the screen changed to 2 images. The first displayed the mushroom cloud that had been seen by so many in the city of New Alexandria. The other showed the large building that had stood there before the explosion. The skyscraper was the regional headquarters of the Molnar Colonial Bank, a financial institution prominent amongst the inner colonies. "As you already know," Cordova began, "on January 6th, an explosion with a blast radius of 300 meters went off within the Molnar regional headquarters." She moved her hand. The screen swiped over to the 3-dimensional depiction of the building's schematics. Cordova magnified the 7th sublevel where a ball of light popped into existence and rapidly expanded out. The explosion rippled upwards through the building's floors in microseconds. Cordova wondered how it might have been for the people working there a heartbeat before they suddenly no longer existed. The explosion funneled through windows, splitting the structural foundation in two before shattering the building completely, sending out a deadly pressure wave over 3 kilometers. Total civilian casualties amounted to more than 6,000, of which 1,952 were fatalities. We only allowed Waypoint and other media outlets to reveal a third of the actual figures. She did a circle with her fingers, and the explosion reversed course, heading back into the Molnar as the building reformed itself. She stopped it once it reached the small ball of light. The explosion began here on sublevel 7, inside a storage vault. Our EOD specialists recovered samples from the site. The screen changed to small pieces of gold under a microscope. We found an unusual quantity of gold fragments close to ground zero, even recovering whole bars that were still intact. Forensics revealed the gold had extraordinarily high traces of iridium mixed within its chemical composition. Even the few undamaged bars showed the presence of high iridium composites. This is unusual because the average quantity we detected was approximately 7.4 times higher than the acceptable limit within which gold bars can be used as liquid assets. That's according to the CAA's legislation on the management of permissible, non-credit-based currencies. I'm aware of the legislation of 2409, the darkness said. It sounds like someone was running a racket at the Molnar, but how does that relate to the bombing? Cordova nodded. Beyond the iridium, we found high traces of explosive residue matching the chemical profile of Composition 12. As you're aware, mixing regular, everyday items with explosive compounds was a common practice by a certain enemy. The insurrectionists, the voice said pensively. Cordova thought she saw the silhouette rematerialize and leaned forward, thinking. She felt free to continue when he said nothing more. During the insurrection, in operations like Trebuchet, the primary cause of UNSC casualties were IEDs disguised as normal objects. One example was an incident on Tribute in 2524, when the wheels of a truck were used to destroy an entire Jim Dandy restaurant. It killed 3 Marines and 38 civilians. We can think of this as the same incident on a much larger scale. So it's the innies then, the silhouette said. I suspected as much, but what other evidence do you have to convince me they signed their personal signature on that mushroom cloud? Cordova ran through the presentation in her mind. She shifted the screen to the mug shot of an Eastern European man in a business suit, whose face suggested he wasn't having the best day. This is Adorjan Adami, the manager of the Molnar Regional Headquarters building. Mr. Adami was not at the Molnar at the time of the explosion. We caught him at the starport about to take an out-system shuttle. After some questioning, we were given access to the Molnar's account information servers. A thorough search found a single account that had transferred nearly 2 billion credits worth of gold to the vault where the explosion occurred. This transfer started with the first deposit in 2532 and ending with the latest deposit as recently as 2 days prior to the meeting at the Octavia. Cordova flipped to the next image, which showed a catalog of enterprises. We couldn't access any personal communications between the Molnar and this account owner, except for private conversations between Mr. Adami himself and our unidentified party. We're not certain why yet, but Adami agreed to have the Molnar act as an unofficial investment bank, converting the gold's worth into credits before funding over 49 different organizations. Most are ordinary corporations who we found no solid connections to. It seems Adami and some within the management were using this account to send out the money as investment funding. The only one we found of particular interest was the group at the very top of the list. Cordova swiped her hand, and a picture came on. This one was a symbol of 2 arrowheads, one inverted and phased over the other to form a letter, A. The Aegis Material Acquisition and Defensive Delivery Services, or AMADDS, is a mercenary group for hire that emerged around the same time as the mysterious account was made. They're the only group under a contractual agreement between the account owner and Mr. Adami to receive a consistent funding of 20% of the account's monetary worth annually. Little is known about them, except that they're black market hitmen on different colony worlds. Other than that, there's little known, even by ONI. To add on top of that, Adami doesn't even know the identity of the account owner. Even worse is that we tried hacking all of his devices for the information but couldn't trace what we found to any known person or entity. Have you tried everything to get answers? The voice asked. Everything, sir. Everything? He asked again, prying further. Everything within our operational limits, sir, Cordova said. She heard a huff from the darkness. Mr. Adami is potentially responsible for the deaths of thousands. If he has valuable information about this account owner or the AMADDS, that leaves us well within our rights to violate his. Human rights, sir? Cordova asked. Whatever rights we see fit to recognize, the voice answered, a hint of anger stalking in his tone. Anyway, what else did you find? Cordova hadn't realized how tense she had become during the exchange. She relaxed her stance. There was a hunch, sir. A hunch? The bars contained high levels of composition 12. It's likely that bars with internal timers were set to go off around the same time as the armament deal once news of it went mainstream. That means that the account owner, whoever they are, was planning this for potentially more than a decade. You're telling me there's someone out there who predicted that Hood would have an armaments deal in the high Octavia and planted bombs just 2 kilometers away in excess of 12 years? The voice cackled to himself. HMPH, I bet the old hag couldn't even see that far into the future, and that's a terrifying precedent in and of itself. Go on, Lieutenant. It's possible that they were simply placing the bombs there, since reach is so important strategically. Their goal in detonating it on the same day as the armament deal may have been more for psychological affect. To say they could have taken out the heart of the UNSC right then and there if they really wanted to. The voice thought to himself. If that's the case, then we need to hunt them down immediately. And we may know where to start hunting, sir, Cordova said. There was a moment of silence from the dark before the response came. Really? Cordova switched to the image of a planet's upper atmosphere. As for a signature on the mushroom cloud, the gold's high iridium levels are characteristic of the gold used by mining facilities on Epsilon Eridani IV, specifically the lesser continent of Arani. Another image appeared. It showed a continent connected to an even larger landmass by a massive isthmus. Arani is rich in iridium and known for its iridium mines that flourished around 2440. However, these mines were shut down by UNSC authorities on the planet during the insurrection. Rebels began using them to mix gold with large amounts of iridium before flooding the markets, selling them as pure gold to support their efforts against the colonial authorities. This threatened the economic stability of the Eridani system and forced the UNSC to shut them down. An old racket, the voice commented. However, Cordova continued, in the wake of the insurrection, most UNSC forces that once secured the mines were redeployed after the Covenant were first encountered on Harvest. This would have given anyone the chance to return to operate the mines in secret. Operating on this hunch, we acquired access to stealth tactical aerial reconnaissance satellites placed over Arani. We discovered that satellite observations by Section II had gone mostly unrecorded for years. This was due to the lack of insurrectionist presence on the surface, as well as the need for satellite intel gathering operations against the Covenant. The board showed pictures of a large complex deep within Arani. They carried the dates the pictures were taken as they moved forward through time. Construction began on structures around the Melianish mining facility, one of many closed during the insurrection. Around May of 2531, the facility suddenly disappeared. Sure enough, the compound vanished in its totality beneath a layer of wildlife. Thermal scans around 2531 revealed that not only was the facility still there, but it also had a growing population. The board showed thermal scans of the area with at first a few dozen, then hundreds and finally several thousand by the time it reached 2544. The silhouette observed the scans for a few seconds. You may not know this, he said, but ONI had tracked one of the 3 major leaders of the insurrection here to Epsilon Eridani before he dropped off our radar. We captured Watts in 2525 and killed Graves in 2531, but the third head honcho got away. "You mean Major Benjamin Kirkley?" Cordova asked. "The former UNSC Army major that defected to the URF." Cordova immediately understood where the conversation was going. "You're saying he's on Epsilon Eridani IV, sir?" "I'm saying there's a chance," the silhouette corrected. "This mining operation began around the same time that he disappeared. To have hidden the entire Melianish building from us, they must be using photoreflective jammer stations. It's the only known human technology capable of fooling satellites like this, meaning this is no simple enemy. Kirkley may be our missing link, and if he's really down there." A deep, contemplative silence passed. It lasted for half a minute, and even Cordova found herself pondering the possibilities. "Lights," the voice said. Immediately, light flooded the room, prying away the mask of shadows from the individual sitting on the opposite side. He was a balding, middle-aged man sporting a UNSC Army officer's uniform. The eagle insignia of a colonel was pinned to his shoulder beside the insignia of ONI. Beneath it was a tag that read, J. Ackerson. He had a smug yet contemplative look on his face that suggested the beginnings of machinations ready to move heaven and earth to have their way. Cordova realized this was her first time seeing her new co. Being a Section 2 girl herself, she had been reasonably wary when her original superior informed her that she would be heading an investigative team under Section 3 leadership. A joint operation between the otherwise autonomous sections was rare in the Office of Naval Intelligence. To have abruptly formed, one had surprised Cordova more than the bombing itself. Yet she had to follow orders. At length, the man rose from his seat and strode over to her. "Congratulations, Lieutenant, you may have just caught us a big fish." He held out his hand to shake. Cordova was suspicious of the gesture. Still, she forced herself to shake it. "Thank you, sir." "Now understand this, Lieutenant. I've been given express authority from HIGHCOM Security Committee to pursue whatever course of action I think necessary to capture and or neutralize those responsible for the Molnar bombing. It's a blank check, and I want you on it." "Sir." "You have the diligence and intelligence I'll need to accomplish the task that lies ahead of us. You'll be serving as my personal aide until this whole thing is over. Understood?" Cordova noticed that his hand grip had tightened almost imperceptibly. She knew it was better to simply get the job done, so this whole operation would be over sooner. She met his tight grip with her own. "Understood. I'll do what I can to help, sir." Asterisk. 2 days later, and Cordova was back in the colonel's office. Organizing a task force capable of dealing with the possible rebel presence on Epsilon Eridani, IV was shaping up to be a perpetual game of tug-o-war. Colonel James Ackerson favored a more direct approach with Marines and armored units invading the mining facility. Cordova favored a stealthier approach, using ODSTs to first investigate the site and confirm the enemy presence there. To simply bring the hammer down without any real considerations for what was really there could lead to an incident of massive proportions. Then they would have to cover up a massacre, which was already a difficult enough task for Section 1 every other week, courtesy of the Covenant, of course. She didn't seem to be able to convince Ackerson of her point. It was as if it were a different man that had asked her to be part of his blank check 2 days ago. He either refused to listen or refuted her points with a measure of logic mixed with personal preference. "I've seen your recommendations, Lieutenant," Ackerson said. "However, it's not feasible for what's necessary here." At the moment, they were arguing in front of the presentation board, which showed the 2 roster lists of units they were considering for the operation. Earlier, he had asked her to compile such a list to present to him, but she hadn't thought it would be just so he could refute it with his own. "Sir," Cordova replied, "an ODST team could land out of scanner range, neutralize the jammer stations, and confirm the insurrectionist presence at the Melianish." "Lieutenant," Ackerson said, a growing irritation in his voice, "you haven't considered that since they have jammer stations, it's equally likely that they will have the capacity to detect any major UNSC forces as soon as they enter local space. If they detect those forces ahead of time, then chances are high that whatever high-value targets are there will take the opportunity to flee. We'll risk losing Kirkley as well as ODSTs needlessly, which is why we'll use the 202nd Expeditionary Marine Division's 1st Battalion as the main ground force. With assistance from the 25th Aerial Reserve Wing and the 75th Armored Division, not to mention an entire battle group, we'll crush even the faintest traces of rebellion on that planet. He folded his arms and looked at her, as if daring her to suggest otherwise. "I disagree, sir," Cordova said. The moment his face hardened told her that here on in she was walking on eggshells. "A tactical insertion enables us to confirm the degree of the hostile presence at the facility. We may very well be walking into a bloodbath in the enemy's favor without that intel. Thermal scans can't show us everything, sir. We need eyes on the ground." Ackerson seemed to briefly consider the matter, then furrow his brows as he grew more irritated. "Your assessment is noted. That said, we cannot allow someone like Kirkley to escape if he's there." "If," Cordova emphasized, "how can we confirm unless we send someone down there?" A scowl crossed Ackerson's face. Cordova could tell he didn't like his plans being criticized as they were now. High-ranking officers in ONI never had to worry about a lower-class agent questioning their plans, but he had made her his liaison officer. While it didn't put them on equal footing, at the very least it allowed her to point out factors that he may not have otherwise considered. Then she thought of something. Section 3 was the branch of ONI responsible for weapons and technology development. They specialized in black ink programs, prioritizing the creation of new technologies, particularly via captured Covenant tech, into usable resources for the UNSC's war effort. She had been lucky up until this point that he hadn't dismissed her. What she was about to do now was push her luck over the edge. "Is there a way for ODSTs to deploy secretly to the ground without being detected, even from space?" She hadn't said it directly. Is there a secret developmental program run by a subdivision of Section 3 that can help us out of our dilemma? But she might as well have said it. Ackerson didn't respond the way she expected. She figured he would point out the fact that she had no authority to ask for such classified information, then have her kicked off the mission, demoted and recommended for psychological evaluation by ONI Psych Branch. Instead, the colonel stood hand to chin. An idea seemed to come to mind, one he looked uncertain about. He sat back behind his desk and sank deeply into his chair. ADT 68499. Established tertiary and quaternary encryption lockouts on all communication sensors connected to this room. A second later, the British-sounding AI answered. Tertiary and quaternary layer encryption lockouts are activated. Ackerson sighed, pinching his nose thoughtfully. "There is a way," he said and clasped his hands together. "We developed a technology, an advanced variant of the ODST's human entry vehicle. We call it the Long-Range Stealth Orbital Insertion Pod. Essentially, while HEVs can only be launched from a vessel in orbit around a planet, the LRSO-IP can be launched from a ship still in slip space. They're also stealth to make them undetectable from ground-side radar systems." Cordova winced. When had they even acquired the know-how to develop such technology? Then again, she reminded herself that it was Section 3. Anything that came out for use by the UNSC was likely a play toy for them 20 years earlier. "That's perfect, sir." "There's just one problem." Ackerson leaned onto the table. "They haven't been tested in real-world combat conditions." "How would that be a problem, sir?" Cordova asked. "Not exactly a problem," Ackerson corrected. "Merely the risk of one. This means whoever you suggested for the op will be the first to field test it. They'll need a month or two of training beforehand. And that worries me because the longer we take, the greater the window our enemy has to escape." "It's still a worthy risk," Cordova said. "It gives us the chance to recon without immediately alerting the enemy. Won't it be worth the capture of a man like Kirkley?" Ackerson breathed out and took a slow breath in. "I see your point, Lieutenant. All right, I'll pull some strings to get access to the pods and get you access to their specs. Now for your end of the deal." He squinted back at the board. "Are you sure about your selection?" Cordova glanced back at the unit she had chosen for the job. "Yes, sir. They're a veteran unit and the best option in my opinion." I see, Ackerson said. He turned back to her. In the end, it seems we'll both get what we want. Not exactly, sir, Cordova said. You still haven't approved of my final recommendation on the operational roster. Cordova felt the air in the room shift unexpectedly. It felt heavy. It manifested itself around the sharp change in the colonel's demeanor. He was no longer relaxed but visibly stiffened. She saw something metastasize behind his eyes that reminded her she was still merely a subordinate. That recommendation, he nearly growled, will not be included. Sir, why not? Because this operation is able to be conducted successfully by Marines, Navy pilots, tank operators, and shock troopers. He shot her a look that could have melted through titanium armor. Ordinary human beings. Cordova quickly realized she wasn't walking on eggshells anymore. She was walking on the minefield of Ackerson's explosive ego. She swallowed. With respect, sir, aren't you aware of the rumors that have been spreading across the front lines over the years? It's no longer an impossibility to deploy them alongside regular troops. They're a liability in more ways than one, but I doubt someone of your rank could understand that. He had taken aim at her credibility. Maybe hers wasn't much compared to his own. Either way, she knew she needed to press her point. Lives were on the line. Colonel, during my initial report, you spoke on the capture of Colonel Watts in 2525 and the elimination of General Graves in 2531. Both were extremely high-profile insurrectionist leaders that led rebellions within entire star systems, and they were both taken out. No ordinary human beings, no ODSTs even, could have pulled off such clandestine operations as those, sir. Ackerson sat back and grumbled under his breath. I'm not about to let Halsey get the glory for this one. Perhaps he was just that angry, but Cordova inwardly recoiled at what may have been a gross breach of military secrecy. Dr. Halsey was famous within ONI, a first-rate intellectual. Sensitive information may have been dumped right in front of her. Information leaks within ONI were as feared as someone with hemophobia finding out they were internally hemorrhaging. The office specialized in making problematic people disappear. The only problem with that was that it made life dangerous for agents themselves. That was because they were surrounded by others that knew how to effectively erase a person. The lieutenant feigned ignorance so the colonel wouldn't think she overheard him. She leaned in closer. We need them. I'm not aware of how extensive their service records are. What I can assume is that if we want the best chances of capturing someone like Kirkley, we'll need them on the task force. Cordova was constantly watching Ackerson's face to make sure she wasn't stepping on a proverbial landmine. The furrowed brow and angry scowl slowly growing on his face, added by the fact he remained silent, told her she may have barely avoided one. Colonel, if we capture Kirkley, you will still be given full credit for the success of the operation. It's still your operation. Cordova's last words seemed to slowly diffuse the man. His brow gradually relaxed, and his scowl lightened as whatever internal demons she had accidentally summoned retreated into the depths. His eyes remained steadfastly locked on hers. All right, Lieutenant, you've convinced me. Cordova perked up. You'll use them. You've convinced me to consider it, he said and nodded towards the door. You're dismissed for today. The lieutenant felt she still had more to say, but decided that it was a battle well fought. She rose up, saluted, and walked out the room. Asterisk. Hubris. Colonel James Ackerson knew, like any sensible agent, that if you wanted to make any headway at all within the Office of Naval Intelligence, then you had to have a certain measure of it in your system, at least a few milliliters above the healthy dose. It gave you an edge over the less motivated within the rank and file. You rose up because you knew that working to emphasize your own success would ultimately contribute to the continuation of humanity, the UNSC, and most importantly, ONI itself. But there were some that simply didn't understand that. They were the ones that would always be subordinate to those who did. Once the seams of the door frame disappeared, Ackerson started tapping his office table. Why was he so irritated? His initial observation of Lieutenant Cordova when he chose her to be responsible for field investigations told him she was the perfect subordinate. Loyal, but not to herself. He felt he could use that. Even so, that conversation had exposed an element within the agent that he wasn't fond of. She was willing to question what should have been unquestionable. He detected a hint of independence. Moreover, and perhaps more dangerously, she seemed to know more than she was letting on, or was at least giving off that impression. No, that wasn't it. Then it clicked. She reminded him of someone. The way she left the room even mirrored how a certain lieutenant commander had also questioned him at a point in their relationship of officer and subordinate. The latter's tendency towards independence was a given. His job required adaptability by its very nature. But the only reason Ackerson was willing to tolerate it was because it got him results. It was the kind of long-term investment that bore fruit every 7 years and increased his own career service vidi in the sight of HIGHCOM. Ackerson realized he was anxious, not angry. That was because at the moment there was little over a year left before the next 300 results were finally ready. It was a long time to wait, but the fact that the waiting period was winding down made him anxious. His attention shifted to Cordova. While a capable liaison officer, she certainly had potential. He decided that he would keep an eye on her. Hopefully, she would also bring him preferential results in the coming days. The colonel thought back to what he told the lieutenant about ordinary human beings being the ones to bring success in the eventual operation. He smiled and laughed to himself. How could he not? After all, only one of them was fully aware of how impossibly hypocritical that statement actually was. Orem Gold. 11 Falchion Base Chapter 5 Pruvdis. Chapter 5 Pruvdis. February 25th, 2544, 26, 05 hours military calendar. Epsilon Eridani system, near Reach. In slipspace aboard the UNSC Juno. Asterisk. Duncan had got to catch up with O'Reilly, Cosmo, and Stanton in the days following the bombing. Everyone was in their respective battalions in different systems. The 15th Battalion was treating Cosmo well enough. Stanton had had a hard time, but he had a few good squadmates to help him adjust to life in the 9th Battalion. However, O'Reilly was a different story. As it turns out, the Irishman was now part of the 10th Battalion, in Duncan's place. They had both been confused about their deployment orders, but gotten settled into each other's units. A bit of a mix-up, but it paid off in the end, O'Reilly had said. Look on the bright side, Sonny Jim, I've got a few cuties on my end thanks to you. If anything, I can only thank you for that, mate. And hey, I think one's got a thing for me. Glad to see that I could help, Duncan had laughed. I guess we'll be taking each other's places from here on in. Since my new nickname is Irish, I figured I might as well get used to talking like you. I'll send you a dictionary of words we use to help you live up to the clout. Can't have my doppelganger defaming my good name now, can I? O'Reilly winked. That was almost 2 months ago. He hadn't told him about how his first mission had gone south, or how he spent the following week at Falchion waking up from nightmare after nightmare of him pulling ownerless limbs from underneath burning rubble. He hadn't even told Erica, or the rest of his team for that matter. He mostly kept it to himself as he worked alongside his fellow ODSTs. He didn't want them to be concerned for him. They had enough to worry about in keeping themselves from being lost to the unknown depths of active slipspace. Less than 2 weeks ago, Lieutenant Colonel Garrison had informed everyone in Bravo Company. They would be participating in an operation in response to the Molnar bombing. That had quickly gotten Duncan's blood up. That meant that they had found whoever was responsible, and there were already rumors spreading among the older ODSTs that it was the insurrectionists. It was the most obvious answer, which was why the troopers were so ready to get to work. Having come to their own conclusions, the Moment Waypoint broadcasted the first images of the bombing. The only problem was that the operation was different by far than anything they had done up until this point. They had been transported from Falchion to the Paris-class heavy frigate UNSC Juno. There they had met with an officer with unknown affiliations. They were given only her name, Lieutenant Cordova. She visibly had Mediterranean roots and a distant disposition to everyone around her. Surprisingly to Duncan, the others also kept a good distance from her unless they needed to engage in direct conversation. Early on, during a chat in the ship's mess hall, Zack had referred to her as a spook. he was promptly slapped in the back of the head by Nova and told to keep his voice down. But the word's meaning wasn't completely lost to Duncan. He had heard it used by Marines in the reserve unit he had served with back on Earth. It was a term used mainly by regular UNSC personnel to identify someone suspected or confirmed to be affiliated with the Office of Naval Intelligence. It was said that you could identify a spook by the way they kept their identities hidden, kept a distance from other servicemen, and were always looking over their shoulders when others were too close. Cordova seemed to match the description, and that didn't bode well with him, or anyone else. Duncan didn't know much about ONI, only rumors that they could make you disappear without a trace and have even your family deny you ever existed. Despite whatever suspicions the ODSTs had, they had to put it aside for the mission. The lieutenant would be working as the liaison officer between them and the commander in charge of the overall operation, a man whose name Duncan didn't know beforehand either. Added to Nemeth, he figured that maybe he should start reading up more on Reach sometime. Colonel James Ackerson was a man that the ODSTs got only the briefest glimpse of when they first came aboard the Juno. He had introduced himself, then given them the rundown of the fact that this new mission would require time and patient training. He then had all 250 of the troopers of Bravo Company sign waivers ensuring their sworn secrecy regarding everything related to this mission under penalty of court-martial. Duncan had hesitantly signed his signature, and so did everyone else. The question thereafter on everyone's mind was what exactly was so top secret that it warranted waivers. After that, Ackerson disappeared from the scene entirely, leaving everything to his liaison officer. Lieutenant Cordova personally briefed the company on the new drop pod technology that would be employed in the upcoming operation. The Long-Range Stealth Orbital Insertion Pod, or LRSO-IP, was a new variant of their own pods. Upon closer inspection, it really wasn't a pod at all, but as Cordova had put it, the smallest manned UNSC ship capable of transitioning from slipspace into normal space safely. The stealth pods were constructed from a simple titanium shell with a layer of heat-resistant lead foil as additional protection for re-entry. The real kicker was the stealth ablative coating that allowed the pod to avoid radar detection. Duncan spent some time considering how that worked, since even while HEVs had a similar level of lead foil and ceramic skin, these features were subject to the intense re-entry flames rudimentarily encountered on any drop. While the external skin burned away to protect the occupant from the extreme temperatures, sometimes the feature failed, and the driver was sentenced to the horrors of heat death within their own pod. Considering that they would be exiting from slipspace, he wondered what other precautions there were to ensure that the alternate space's radiative effects didn't fry their pod's electronics and leave them tumbling helplessly towards a planet. He quickly found out. Lieutenant Colonel Garrison had come along for the trip since, unlike most battalion commanders, he had a direct leadership role as company commander for Bravo. He had worked with Cordova during the preliminary tests to choose the best ODST teams to conduct the first drops. While modern shock troopers had since the HEV's introduction into service in 2461 to grow accustomed to piloting them, the ODSTs of Bravo Company had less than 2 months to do the same with the LROSIPs. That meant regular training drops from the Juno. First Platoon and the rest of Bravo Company had, every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday, found themselves launching from the Juno's drop bay into slipstream space. The fact the Juno was a Paris class allowed for the entire company to drop simultaneously. It was something impossible for smaller variants like the Stalwarts that had a more limited drop capacity, making the Paris more ideal for ODST operations. The troopers would fall through slipspace in the wake of the Juno before transitioning into the Epsilon Eridani system just above Reach. They would hit the drop zone and quickly regroup, marking the end of the exercise. They encountered problems early on. Not everyone transitioned at the same time or came out in the same place. That left drop formations more disorganized, an issue the lieutenant colonel had sought to rectify as time passed. Then there were some ODSTs that didn't transition at all. Since they started training, there were at least 2 shock troopers in Bravo Company who were confirmed to have dropped from the Juno but never emerged into real space: Private Aidan Dykes and Sergeant Tero Strawson. No one knew what happened to them, and most understood that they likely never would. The trainings continued regardless. Duncan had used the opportunity to integrate with the rest of Epsilon and observe the way they dropped. Everyone griped about the heat on the way down. Usually late into a drop, Yuri would delay pulling the chute until he reached just within the danger limit. While the staff regularly ordered him against it, doing so made his pod burn as bright as a comet. The way he shouted in euphoric Russian on his way down made it almost seem fun. While Duncan surely wasn't going to try it himself, he couldn't say it wasn't interesting to look at. On free days, they worked on learning pod maintenance along with a team of tech specialists. While the pods were bulkier than regular HEVs, they were surprisingly easier to take care of than their predecessors. Duncan chalked that up to ONI being able to develop better gear on a whole for the standard trooper. It also made him wonder what else ONI could, and had already made that they just weren't telling anyone about: creations held in secret that could possibly turn the tide of the war. Today he was focused on memorizing the stealth pod schematics inside the Juno's mess hall. While it was nighttime on Reach, it was breakfast time for the ODSTs, and everyone was trying to eat fast before the day's training began. Duncan took a spoonful of cornmeal from his bowl after he read a paragraph on the stealth pod schematics sent to an information pad. The lieutenant had provided the pads to some of the NCOs for studying its functions, and Duncan had asked the staff for his. "You sure you don't want to eat first, study later?" Rico asked, wiping the bacon grease off his mouth. "You've got time once we get back on board." "I'm multitasking," Duncan said through a mouthful of cornmeal. "The last thing I want is for the pod to kick out on me before I've even transitioned." Nova knifed through the second half of her omelet while side-eyeing Duncan. "Leave him be. If he wants a better chance of not ending up like Dykes or Strawson, then more power to him." "Nerd," Zach coughed. Duncan didn't even look up from the screen. A novice nerd's more useful on a mission than a dead dunce. Zach choked on his coffee a little. Duncan gave him a competitive look and he smirked back, ready to meet the challenge. The moment Nova saw him about to open his mouth, she took her fork and shoved a piece of her omelet into it, quickly shutting him up. Zach recoiled and gave a muffled scream as the egg steamed his tongue. Nova and the rest of Epsilon laughed, save for the staff who walked up to the table with coffee in hand. "Now, Specialist, what did I tell you about torturing our radio men? If his tongue's seared, how's he going to talk properly to the people we need to hear from the most?" "Sorry, sir," she half-heartedly apologized. The staff looked past her, shook his head, and pointed behind her. Nova looked back to see Zach leaning over her plate with his mouth open, allowing a mush of fried eggs and diced vegetables to fall on the rest of her omelet. It fell painfully slowly. When he was done, he looked up and froze once he saw Nova glowering down at him with a murderous glint in her eyes. He gave a nervous laugh. Hector quickly intervened, wordlessly getting out of his seat to push Zach to the other side before sitting down between them, continuing to eat his bowl of cereal. "If you think you've saved him, you haven't," Nova murmured, glaring down at her defiled breakfast. "I know," Hector said simply, taking another spoonful of cereal, "just delaying the inevitable." The staff didn't bother sitting down. Instead, he went over to Duncan. "Private, I need to speak with you." Duncan put his bowl aside. "Is it the pad, sir? You can have it back. I'm almost done, but—" "No," the staff said. "The pad stays, you come." The staff sergeant said nothing more as he strode for the door of the mess hall. Duncan peered at the others, who gave him uncertain looks. He got up and followed the staff through the exit. The two walked for a few minutes through the ship's halls, passing by crewmen on their way to stations and technicians handling corridor panels. They stopped at a window somewhere in the Juno's midsection. Beyond the viewing glass, the bright green and blue globe that was Reach was no larger than a coin against the backdrop of stars. The staff spent a few moments staring out into the vastness of space and sipping his mug of coffee. When he was satisfied, he turned to Duncan, eyeing him with a good deal of suspicion. "Do you know why I called you out here, Private?" "No, sir." The staff took another sip of his coffee. I decided early on not to ask you how you felt about the Molnar because I wanted to see how you'd react to it over time. You sure don't look it, but I've got a hunch that says you're good at hiding it when something bothers you. He placed his mug on the windowsill and turned to fully face him. Long story short, I want to know what Private Duncan Iris' mental state is after seeing his first glimpse of action. Duncan's brow furrowed. Action, sir. Back in New Alexandria. That counted. We didn't even fight. The staff scrutinized him further. One thing you'll need to know out here is that action isn't drawn-out heroics like any of the propaganda reels they show back on Earth. Out here it happens, he snapped his finger. Just like that, and just like that. He snapped again. It's over. It's a split second that marks the difference between life and death. What I want to know is whether experiencing it for the first time either gave you a taste for it or knocked the fight out of you completely. If I don't find out now, it may compromise our combat capacity as a squad further down the road. Duncan's gaze fell to the floor. You want to know if I still have it in me to go back out there, sir? The staff nodded. I know the rest of the squad and most of their strengths and weaknesses, but I'm still gauging you. I'm no weak link, sir, Duncan lightly laughed. The staff remained serious. What I want to know, trooper, is what you were thinking when you were helping us move those dead bodies from the Molnar for half a day, non-stop. What I want to know is where your head's at. Duncan swallowed, feeling his mouth go dry. He knew exactly what the man was asking for. He simply didn't know how to say it outright. He didn't want them to think he was a liability. He had what it took to be a trooper. He had made it this far, hadn't he? Duncan thought twice about it and reminded himself that that wasn't what was being asked of him either. What was being asked was what he thought. If the staff had been monitoring him out of the corner of his eye for almost 2 months, then there was little he could do to avoid telling the truth. When we were at the site, I honestly wanted to throw up then and there. He looked at the staff who nodded for him to go on. His attention turned to the distant planet. I've never been in combat or anything nearly as chaotic as that before, so it was a real shock to suddenly be seeing so much of it in one go. I remembered looking at everyone else. I was jealous that you guys seemed to be so unaffected by it. You just got the job done with no problems. It reminded me that I've still got ways to go, you know. At the time, I felt like I shouldn't have even been there. He blinked at the last thought. I remember staring back as we were leaving New Alexandria and thinking, wow, what did I just get myself into? When he was finished, he looked up to the staff who was leaning against the wall, thinking on what he said. Had any nightmares? Yes, sir. I see. The staff picked up the mug and took another long sip. Did you actually ask anyone else what they were thinking after the bombing? Duncan shook his head. Then how would you know they weren't affected? Their visors were polarized, you couldn't see their faces, so how do you know that? Duncan froze where he stood. He didn't know how to answer. Don't get me wrong, the staff sighed. They're 6 of the toughest helljumpers I've ever met. Some of them are so stiff-necked that even an elite would have trouble cutting through it. But as much as they're shock troopers, they're also still human. What you saw them do out there shows one of 2 things. Either they've learned to hide it well, or they've learned to harness it well. Harness it. They use it, the staff explained. It acts as the motivation to help them get the job done because when it comes down to the wire, they know what their reason is for fighting. They drive it, they don't let it drive them. Duncan recalled his nightmares that had haunted him for the last few weeks after the bombing. The staff sergeant's words cut like a surgeon's knife through a slumbering patient, precise and efficient. Can I ask you something, sir? Go ahead. Which do you do? The staff looked at him with surprising casualness. Depends on what time of day you ask me. He turned back to the window. My point is that I want you to harness it. You'll need to for this upcoming op. That way, when you look down your gun sights at the faces of the people that bombed the Molnar, you won't hesitate. Duncan understood what he was saying. Once they were on the ground and facing the enemy, there would be no going back. He had to have the resolve to pull the trigger before he got there and shape up before this war did it for him. He could wear the Helljumper BDU and have all the training to be called one, but to actually be one was a state of mind, one he was going to have to learn. A woman's voice came on over the ship's communication systems. interrupting his thoughts. All Bravo Company personnel, please report to the drop bay on level E for scheduled training. The message repeated 2 more times, then stopped. Level E, Duncan sighed. E for eviction, the staff said, time to go. Footsteps coming from behind them caught their attention. They turned around to see none other than the lieutenant colonel walking unconcernedly down the hall towards them. They both quickly saluted as he came up to them and nodded in turn. Staff Private. Good day, sir, Duncan said. Ready for the drop. Always ready, son, Garrison said. You mind if I borrow your staff sergeant for a minute? Duncan quickly shook his head. No, sir, I'll be on my way. Thanks. Asterisk. Duncan jogged off, heading for the nearest elevator. Garrison started off at a stroll, and the staff followed close behind. I think I've figured it out, sir, Adel said. Garrison looked at him with a curious smirk. Really, and what's that? Why, you brought Iris along. The lieutenant colonel's curious smirk slowly faded into a cool, contemplative grimace. The deployment orders, sir. The mix-up wasn't an accident, was it? No, came the simple reply. The staff nodded, hesitated for a moment, then continued. During a conversation last month, I learned a thing or two about him. And not to change topics, sir, but it's really the same topic. Remember way back when you used to tell me, Joel's and Harper, those stories? Garrison looked him in the eye. Yes. Well, sir, that name came up a few times. The older ODST stopped for a moment, allowing the younger to go slightly ahead of him. He gave the staff a look that was a mixture of intrigue and respect. You don't miss anything, do you? Really, I only wanted to speak with you because I was curious to see if you'd figured it out already. Tell me again why you're a helljumper and not a detective. The staff shrugged. I found work where I could, sir. The comment earned a laugh that was shared between the two of them as they carried on towards the elevator. So what about Private Iris? Is he shaping up to be a promising addition to your squad? Garrison asked. The staff nodded. Harper and Joel say he needs some work, but we had to admit he's got a spark in him. But that's not really why you picked him, is it, sir? Garrison slowly shook his head. Then, why exactly, from your point of view? The two arrived at the elevator, and the staff pressed the button for level E. Garrison caught sight of the viewing window and the vast space beyond. Why, an aged memory played in his head, just an old promise. He watched the doors close, sealing away the sight of the stars as they descended deeper into the ship. Asterisk. 3, 2, go, go, go. At the end of Garrison's countdown, the ODSTs of Bravo Company inside of their stealth pods launched from the Juno's drop bay like bullets being fired from a rifle. Duncan clenched his teeth against the jarring effect of the launch that caused him to bite his tongue on a few occasions. He watched his pod and hundreds of others fall away from the heavy cruiser and into slipstream space. They fell in a spiral-like array, vaguely reminding him of a DNA strand as they headed through the void. Transition in 30 seconds, Garrison said over company comms. Zach came in over Team Freak. Now for the hard part. Duncan felt his pod beginning to rattle, jostling him from side to side. They had already had weeks of training to prepare for this, but the unusually bumpy ride, more so than one could expect from a regular insertion, was almost impossible to get used to. It was like what he'd experienced when the pressure wave from the Molnar hit, then to drag out that experience for 30 seconds straight. Duncan punched in the codes on a nearby pad that would begin the pod's transition sequence. He counted the seconds in his head. 25 seconds, 15 seconds, 5 seconds. Transition, Garrison said over comms. Duncan punched the green button that immediately entered the sequence. Through his pod's window, he saw others ahead of him transition into normal space. A split second later, his pod was enveloped in a bright flash of pale blue light, causing his helmet to polarize to compensate. A heartbeat later, his helmet depolarized as the stars winked on all around him. The closest star of Epsilon Eridani blazed sunlight through the viewport. After only being in the void for 30 seconds, it still came as a relief to see daylight again. A list of stellar coordinates appeared on one of his displays, personalized to him and his squad. All Bravo Company personnel meet at your designated coordinates. Wedge formation, let's go. Duncan pushed the pod's joysticks forward and manipulated his rocket thrusters to plummet even faster towards Reach. The rest of Bravo Company were already assembling into a wedge formation with the lieutenant colonel at its descending tip. Duncan maneuvered his pod to fly just above the staffs, as the rest of Squad Epsilon and 1st Platoon took up the rear guard of the formation. They descended into the exosphere. Within 2 minutes, the reentry flames had started and were licking over the stealth pod's frames. At 1 minute and 30 seconds, Garrison ordered them to break up into their platoon clusters. Their initial wedge formation was to make sure they landed in relatively the same regional area. Breaking up into their platoon clusters was a necessary precaution taken later into the drop to keep ODSTs from landing on top of each other. It also kept them relatively close to their base units. At 1 minute, everyone pulled their drag chutes. Multiple ODSTs whipped back in their pods as their insertion vectors slowed dramatically. Everyone except Yuri seemed to get the hint. "Matchstick, get that drag chute out now," the staff demanded. "Matchstick do this, Matchstick do that, but no one asked Matchstick why he's called Matchstick," Yuri said. "Why jivu ch Toby Goret?" He continued on ahead of them. "Matchstick," the staff said, sternness entering his voice. A few tense seconds passed, then Yuri's pod released its drag chute. He was still ahead of the rest of the formation, but they were slowly catching up. Duncan could hear him laughing and shouting in his native tongue on his way down. Duncan calmed Hector. "Hey, heck. Yeah. Is he actually bipolar? You saw what he did, you tell me, man." The formation continued down to the surface, drifting slightly apart. They burst through the clouds, turning them into Swiss cheese with the barrage of pods. It was nighttime on this part of Reach. Below, Duncan could see their drop zone coming into view. It was an Arctic landscape. There was a frigid sea near the horizon where icebergs the size of cruisers patrolled the waters. At 50 meters, the braking rockets on 248 pods activated. A second later, they slammed into the frozen terrain. They blew off their hatches and leaped out with weapons at the ready. Duncan blew off his hatch and jumped out into a foot of snow. He scanned the tundra plain around him through the scope of his M7. There was little save for a few snow mounds and other LRSOIPs landing nearby. The Babbed Katha ice shelf was a barren snowscape with a 200-meter-tall cliff face over a kilometer away from where he'd landed. They had been constantly dropping here over the last 2 months as a sort of testing ground. In the distance, he could see the shadow of a pyramidal structure with segmented sides amidst the mountains of a distant land protrusion. He wasn't aware of any UNSC bases in the area, and neither was anyone else he asked. But they decided to simply accept it was there rather than risk asking more questions that might get them offed. A nav point appeared in his HUD at the base of a nearby snow mound. Duncan and the rest of Squad Epsilon winked their green acknowledgement lights and started towards it. Asterisk. Colonel Ackerson watched from the balcony of an observation tower on the Babbed Katha ice shelf as the ODSTs of Bravo Company began gathering up. He was pleased at the progress they were making with the stealth pod training. On the other hand, he was concerned at the amount of time that had already passed since the discovery on Epsilon Eridani IV. Cordova had a team keep an eye on the movements of the individuals at the Melianish facility. So far, there were no major developments. That meant they were still unaware of the large proverbial hammer that he was about to strike them with from orbit. A door opened, and Lieutenant Cordova stepped out, saluting. "The exercise for today is completed, sir." "Casualties?" "None this time, sir. Anchor 9 confirmed that all 248 pods successfully transitioned from slipspace." "Good," he said, smiling at the results. "They're almost ready." "Are we still looking at the 6th, sir?" Ackerson nodded. "We can't go any later than that. We need to finish this and quickly, and it already cost me a pound of flesh just to use the ice shelf. And I think you know why." Cordova glanced at the distant mountains and the pyramidal structure that was partially hidden with them. I understand, sir. She saluted again and moved for the door, but stopped halfway in. Also, Colonel, all the requested forces have arrived in system for the operation. As of now, they're all on standby. Ackerson gritted his teeth, then forced himself to relax. All of them. All of them, sir. She watched him closely. The colonel closed his eyes and breathed out. Good, very good. But the subtle grimace on his face showed that it wasn't. He was swallowing his pride here in more ways than one. As he looked out to the squadrons of pelicans that began arriving on the Babbed Katha ice shelf to pick up the ODSTs, he hoped swallowing that pride now would allow him to resurrect it to even greater heights once this operation was over. Proof advanced.